There is a woman in American music right now whose entire career is a structural impossibility that nobody has identified as such. Her name is Mariah Buckles. You know her as Mariah the scientist, and everything you think you know about how she got here is wrong. Not wrong in the way that celebrity biographies are usually wrong, where the details are slightly off or the timeline is compressed. Wrong in a deeper way. Wrong because the frame itself is wrong. The frame says, talented girl from Atlanta discovers music, gets signed, becomes a star, and every element of that sentence is technically accurate and fundamentally misleading, in the same way that saying a river carved the Grand Canyon is technically accurate but completely obscures the tectonic forces, the millions of years of sediment deposition, the specific mineral composition of the rock strata, the exact angle of water flow required to produce that specific formation, and no other. The Grand Canyon was not carved by a river. It was produced by a system. And Mariah the scientist was not produced by talent. She was produced by a system so intricate, so precisely configured, that once you understand its components, her emergence stops looking like a career and starts looking like an inevitability. Here is what I'm going to do in the next several hours. I am going to reverse engineer that system. I'm going to take every visible element of Mariah Buckles' public trajectory, her high school, her university, her decision to drop out, her discovery by Tory Lanez, her relationship with Young Thug, her musical style, her aesthetic presentation, her code-switching ability, her positioning within black cultural spaces and white institutional spaces simultaneously. And I'm going to show you that none of these are independent events. Every single one is a downstream output of a structural configuration that was set in motion decades before she was born, by demographic shifts, policy decisions, educational resource allocations, housing market dynamics, insurance underwriting patterns, and the peculiar geography of DeKalb County, Georgia, in the years following white flight. By the time we are done, you will understand something that no existing analysis of Mariah the scientist has ever articulated, something that no music journalist, no cultural commentator, no academic has surfaced, because seeing it requires holding multiple disciplinary lenses simultaneously: sociology, economics, urban geography, education policy, capital theory, performance studies, and the structural mechanics of the American entertainment industry, and looking through all of them at the same time. No single lens reveals the pattern. The pattern only becomes visible at the intersection. Let me start with a number: 94%. That is the percentage of students at Southwest DeKalb High School who identify as black. Here's another number: 100%. That is the percentage of students at Southwest DeKalb who qualify for free or reduced price lunch, the federal marker for economic disadvantage. Here's a third number: 19%. That is the percentage of Southwest DeKalb students who are proficient in mathematics against a state average of 39%. And here is a fourth number, one that most people have never heard: $2.3 million. That is the amount that prosecutors alleged was siphoned from the DeKalb County school system through fraudulent construction contracts during the Crawford-Lewis scandal, a racketeering case that resulted in the superintendent's guilty plea and triggered a cascade of institutional failure, the near loss of accreditation, the governor's removal of 6 school board members, a revolving door of 7 superintendents and interim superintendents in the years that followed. These 4 numbers are not background information. They are the load-bearing walls of the invisible architecture that produced Mariah Buckles. Every element of her trajectory traces back to these numbers and the structural conditions they represent. Now, to understand why these numbers matter, you have to understand what DeKalb County is. Not what it looks like on a map, what it is as a system. DeKalb County sits on the eastern edge of metropolitan Atlanta. It is the 4th most populous county in Georgia, with more than 760,000 residents. Its racial composition, as of the most recent census data, is approximately 50% black, 28% white, 11% Hispanic, and 7% Asian. But those aggregate numbers obscure the actual structure. DeKalb County is not diverse in the way that number suggests. It is segregated along a clean geographic axis. The northern portion of the county, areas like Dunwoody, Brookhaven, parts of Chamblee, is predominantly white and Asian, with higher median incomes, better funded schools, and denser institutional infrastructure. The southern portion, areas surrounding Lithonia, Stonecrest, the unincorporated communities near Interstate 20, is overwhelmingly black, with lower median incomes, schools that rank in the bottom half of the state, and an institutional landscape defined by churches, small businesses, and the remnants of infrastructure built for a different population. This bifurcation did not happen randomly. It happened because of a specific historical process that urban sociologists have documented in detail, but that almost nobody connects to the biographies of the individuals it produces. In the 1950s and 60s, DeKalb County was a white suburban enclave. The homes in what is now South DeKalb were built for white families fleeing the urbanization of Atlanta proper. The schools were built for white children. The commercial infrastructure, the shopping centers, the medical facilities, the recreational spaces, was calibrated to white middle-class consumer patterns. Then, beginning in the 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s and 90s, two simultaneous forces reshaped the county. The first was black suburban migration. Following the election of Maynard Jackson as Atlanta's first black mayor in 1973, a wave of black middle-class and upper-middle-class families began moving outward from the city core into the suburban ring. Jackson's mandate that 35% of city contracts go to minority-owned firms, combined with the expansion of federal employment and the growth of Atlanta's black professional class, created a generation of black families with enough economic capital to buy homes in previously white suburbs. The second force was white flight. As black families moved in, white families moved out, eastward into Rockdale and Newton counties, northward into Gwinnett, and further still into exurban counties like Cherokee and Forsyth. The result was a county-level demographic inversion that happened over roughly 2 decades. South DeKalb went from majority white to majority black. But here is the critical structural detail that almost everyone misses. When white families leave a neighborhood, they take their incomes, their tax contributions, and their consumer spending with them. But they cannot take the physical infrastructure. The houses remain, the school buildings remain, the commercial plazas remain, the road networks, the utility infrastructure, the zoning designations, all of it stays. What you get is a phenomenon that has no clean name in the literature, but that I will call infrastructural lag, a condition in which the physical built environment of a community reflects the economic capacity of a previous population, while the current population operates at a different economic stratum. The homes in South DeKalb were built for families earning $70,000 or $80,000 in 1980s money. The black families who moved in were, in many cases, solidly middle class. But the median household income in South DeKalb today is approximately $48,000, with a poverty rate exceeding 20%. The infrastructure suggests one economic reality. The population lives another. This matters enormously for understanding who Mariah Buckles is, because she was born into this gap. She was born in 1997 in Atlanta into a black family that, based on all available signals, her attendance at Southwest DeKalb, her father's work as a real estate agent, her mother's position as a finance manager, the family's ability to send her to college in New York, was positioned in the black middle class. Not the upper middle class, not the affluent class that would have lived in Cascade or sent their children to private schools in Buckhead or Sandy Springs. The middle class. The class that in South DeKalb meant living in a home that might have been worth $300,000 in a neighborhood where many surrounding homes were worth half that. The class that meant having parents with professional jobs but not professional class networks. The class that meant attending a public school, Southwest DeKalb, that was once a model of advanced placement implementation, honored by the College Board in 2006 as an example of excellence in AP class delivery, and whose marching band performed at the opening ceremonies of the 1996 Summer Olympics. A school with real institutional memory, a school that by the time Mariah attended it was hemorrhaging resources, watching its accreditation threatened and serving a student body that was almost entirely economically disadvantaged. This is the paradox of infrastructural lag as it applies to individual formation. The school Mariah attended still had the skeleton of excellence. The AP course offerings were still nominally available, the physical plant was still standing, the institutional identity still carried prestige within the local community, but the substance behind the skeleton was hollowing. The Crawford Lewis scandal was not just a story about one corrupt superintendent, it was a detection signal, a surface-level eruption of a deeper structural collapse. When prosecutors alleged that the school system's chief operating officer funneled over $2 million in construction contracts to her husband, while the superintendent signed off on it, they were describing a system in which the gap between what the schools were supposed to deliver and what the tax base could support had become so vast that the administrative class began extracting personal value from the shortfall rather than closing it. The fraudulent payments totaling $2.3 million were not the disease. They were a symptom. The disease was a structural fiscal insufficiency that made it impossible for South DeKalb schools to compete with neighboring Gwinnett County, where the tax base was wealthier, the demographic transition had not occurred, and the schools consistently ranked higher. So when we say Mariah Buckles graduated from Southwest DeKalb a year early, we need to understand what that means structurally. It means she navigated a school system that was simultaneously prestigious and collapsing. It means she was likely in the top academic tier of an institution where only 19% of students are proficient in math. It means she was probably in AP classes. Southwest DeKalb offered them in chemistry, biology, physics, calculus, English, European history, French, Spanish, government, and several other subjects. But that the AP classes at a school like Southwest DeKalb are qualitatively different from AP classes at, say, Chamblee High School across the county line or any of the well-funded schools in Gwinnett. Same course names, same exam at the end, different teaching quality, different peer environment, different tacit preparation. This is precisely what the sociologist Samuel Lucas calls effectively maintained inequality. The principle that even when access to a quantitative educational level is equalized, everyone can take AP classes, the qualitative differences within that level, how rigorous those AP classes actually are, what kind of preparation they actually provide, continue to reproduce social stratification. The students at Southwest DeKalb who took AP calculus were not receiving the same education as students at Brookwood High School in Gwinnett, who took AP calculus, even though both received the same course designation on their transcripts. The designation was equal. The substance was not. And yet, Mariah graduated early. She was clearly in the upper percentile of academic performance at her school. She earned a biology scholarship to St. John's University in New York. That scholarship is the first evidence of what I'm going to call her capital conversion capability, the ability to take the institutional capital available in her specific environment and translate it into returns that exceed what her environment's pipeline was designed to deliver. The pipeline for a high-performing black student from Southwest DeKalb, circa 2013 when she likely matriculated, ran through a narrow set of options: Georgia State University, Kennesaw State, perhaps a historically black college or university like Spelman or Clark Atlanta, if the family could supplement the cost. Going to St. John's University in Queens, New York, on a biology scholarship represented a departure from the pipeline. Not a dramatic one, since St. John's is not an Ivy League institution, but a departure nonetheless. It required the admissions office to see her as legible, academically competitive enough to merit the scholarship, and culturally coherent enough to survive a campus environment 1,400 miles from home in one of the most expensive and culturally alien cities a South DeKalb teenager could encounter. Her stated goal was to become a pediatric anesthesiologist. And here is where the analysis gets uncomfortable, because this ambition, noble, specific, medically rigorous, reveals a structural misalignment that Mariah almost certainly could not have perceived at the time. Pediatric anesthesiology is one of the most competitive subspecialties in American medicine. The pathway runs through a 4-year pre-medical undergraduate curriculum with competitive organic chemistry and biochemistry sequences, then acceptance to medical school, then a 4-year residency in anesthesiology, then a 1-year fellowship in pediatric anesthesiology. The total training pipeline is approximately 13 years post-high school. The students who successfully navigate this pipeline overwhelmingly come from environments where the following conditions are present: parents who are themselves physicians or in adjacent professions, providing tacit knowledge about how to navigate medical school applications, clinical rotations, and residency matches. Family financial resources sufficient to absorb the opportunity cost of 13 years of training with minimal income. High school preparation in science and mathematics that is genuinely competitive at the national level, not a P classes in name, but AP classes with the rigor that produces scores of 4 and 5 on the exam. And peer networks composed of other students on similar trajectories, providing both social reinforcement and informational resources. Mariah Buckles came from an environment where her father sold real estate and her mother managed finances. Neither was a physician. Her high school, however prestigious in local reputation, was producing math proficiency in fewer than 1 in 5 students. Her peer network at Southwest DeKalb was composed overwhelmingly of students who were not on pre-medical trajectories. She did not have the tacit knowledge infrastructure. She did not have the STEM preparation depth. She had ambition and intelligence, and those are necessary but structurally insufficient for navigating one of the most brutal institutional pipelines in American professional life. And here is the pattern that begins to emerge, the pattern that will structure everything that follows. Mariah Buckles possessed a configuration of capital: academic ability sufficient to graduate early, institutional literacy sufficient to navigate a scholarship application to an out-of-state university, code-switching fluency that allowed her to operate across racial registers, an aesthetic presentation that read as simultaneously authentically black and accessible to non-black spaces, and the cultural sensibility of someone raised at the intersection of Atlanta's black middle class and its hip-hop-inflected cultural production that was too sophisticated for the pipeline her environment offered, but not quite sophisticated enough, not quite embedded enough in the right networks to fully optimize the institutional path she aimed for. She was, in the language of the framework I am building here, in the 92nd percentile of institutional capability within a system whose designated ceiling was maybe the 75th percentile, and whose actual apex pipeline required the 98th. She was too much for where she was. She was not quite enough for where she was going. And it is in that gap, that specific, measurable structural gap, that everything that would happen next becomes not just explicable but inevitable. Because what happens when an individual possesses a capital portfolio that is mismatched to every available pipeline? They do not simply fail, they migrate. They find the marketplace where the capital they do have commands the highest premium. And for a woman with Mariah Buckles' exact configuration, her vocal ability, her aesthetic composition, her institutional literacy, her cultural fluency, her proximity to Atlanta's entertainment infrastructure, and her navigational sophistication, that marketplace was not medicine. It was never going to be medicine, It was the one marketplace in America where being simultaneously institutionally literate and culturally authentic, simultaneously legible in white boardrooms and black barbershops, simultaneously capable of reading a contract and writing a hook, where that specific and extraordinarily rare combination of attributes is not just valued, but desperately, structurally needed. That marketplace is the American music industry, and Mariah Buckles did not choose it. The system chose it for her. She just had to stop resisting the current. Before we go deeper into the system that produced Mariah Buckles, I need to show you the blueprint, not the blueprint she followed. There was no blueprint to follow because no one has ever mapped this territory. I mean, the blueprint that already existed in the Cultural Archive, hiding in plain sight in a 2006 film that grossed $21 million at the box office, and that almost nobody analyzed for what it actually was. The film is called A TL. It was directed by Chris Robinson, written by Tina Gordon Chisholm from a story by Antoine Fisher, and it was loosely based on the experiences of its producers Dallas Austin and T-Boz from TLC, growing up in Atlanta. T.I. starred as Rashad, a high school senior navigating his final year in Atlanta's working-class black neighborhoods. But the character I need you to focus on is not Rashad. It is the woman he falls for. Her name in the film is Erin, but everyone calls her Nunu. She is played by Lauren London, and the structural architecture of Nunu's character is so precisely parallel to the real-life architecture of Mariah Buckles that understanding one becomes the skeleton key for understanding the other. Here is what happens in ATL. Nunu appears at Cascade, the famous roller skating rink in Southwest Atlanta, a real institution, by the way, that functioned for decades as one of the primary social marketplaces for Black Atlanta. She presents as a girl from the neighborhood. She dresses the part. She speaks the part. She moves through the space with the fluency of someone who grew up in it. T.I.'s character. Rashad is immediately drawn to her, and nothing about her presentation triggers any signal that she is anything other than what she appears to be, a black girl from his world operating at his level, legible in his terms. This is critical. The entire first act of their relationship operates on the premise that she is who she appears to be. And she is convincing enough that it takes an active discovery, Rashad physically going to her house and seeing the affluence firsthand, to break the illusion. He could not detect it from interaction alone. Her mimicry was that complete. Because here is what Nunu actually is. She is the daughter of John Garnett, played by Keith David, a wealthy black CEO. She lives in an affluent home. She attends what the film codes as an elite or private educational environment. She has access to resources, a car, spending money, a social life underwritten by her father's economic position that are categorically different from the resources available to Rashad and his friends. She is not from the neighborhood. She is visiting the neighborhood, but she is visiting it so skillfully that the neighborhood cannot tell. Now, most analyses of ATL, to the extent that anyone has analyzed it at all, frame Nunu's storyline as a romantic subplot about secrets and authenticity. The rich girl pretending to be poor, the class tension that erupts when the truth comes out. And that reading is not wrong, but it is catastrophically shallow because it misses what is actually happening at the structural level. What Nunu is doing is not pretending. Pretending implies a costume that can be removed. What she is doing is deploying capital, specifically deploying a configuration of social capital, cultural capital, and human capital that she accrued in her affluent environment into a social marketplace where that capital is simultaneously invisible and extraordinarily valuable. Let me break down the mechanics. In the affluent environment where Nunu actually lives, her capital portfolio is unremarkable. She is one of many daughters of successful black professionals. Her social capital, her network, her connections, her family's reputation, operates within a defined field where everyone has similar capital. Her cultural capital, her education, her aesthetic sensibility, her behavioral norms, is standard for her environment. In Bordeaux's terms, she is adequately capitalized for her field, but not distinctively capitalized. She has what everyone around her has. There is no surplus. There is no premium. She is, within her own world, average. But here's what happens when she takes that same capital portfolio and deploys it at Cascade in Rashad's neighborhood. Suddenly, everything changes. The social capital she carries, the poise, the confidence that comes from economic security, the ease of navigating social situations that characterizes people who have never had to worry about material survival, reads in this new environment not as average, but as magnetic. The cultural capital she possesses, the ability to speak in registers that code as educated without coding as pretentious, the aesthetic sensibility that comes from access to resources, the behavioral fluency that allows her to adapt to the norms of this new environment while retaining the underlying structure of her original environment, makes her legible as both authentic and elevated. She is perceived as someone who belongs, but who is somehow more. And the financial capital that underwrites all of it, the car, the clothes, the ability to show up at social events without the strain that accompanies financial precarity, functions as a kind of ambient signal that she is someone worth being around, even though the financial dimension is precisely what she is concealing. This is capital arbitrage. It is the direct social equivalent of what happens in financial markets when an asset that is priced at one value in one market is simultaneously priced at a higher value in another market, and a trader exploits the differential by buying in the cheap market and selling in the expensive one. Except in this case, the asset is not a financial instrument. It is a configuration of personal attributes, and the markets are not stock exchanges. They are social environments with different scarcity profiles. In Nunu's home environment, her capital is abundant. Everyone has it, so it commands no premium. In Rashad's environment, her capital is scarce. Almost no one has it in that specific configuration, so it commands an enormous premium. She is not doing anything deceptive in the mechanical sense. She is simply existing in an environment where who she already is carries more value than it carries at home. But there is a deeper layer, and this is where the ATL blueprint connects directly to the Mariah Buckles case study, and where both connect to a structural dynamic that, as far as I can determine, has never been formally articulated in any academic literature. The deeper layer is this. Nu does not just benefit from capital arbitrage. She requires bridge functions to execute it. She cannot simply appear at Cascade alone and begin transacting. She needs intermediaries, people who exist in the target environment and who, for whatever reason, have enough cross-cultural compatibility with her to form the initial connection that gives her entry. In the film, these bridge functions are performed by the group of black women she arrives with. These women are coded as being from the neighborhood, but possessing some degree of cultural sophistication that allows them to be friends with someone like Nu without being suspicious of her. They are the connective tissue. Without them, Nu has no entry point. With them, she has a seamlessly constructed social identity that's indistinguishable from the environment she is entering. These bridge functions are not random, they are structural. In any environment where two social strata overlap, where there is geographic proximity between communities with different capital profiles, there will be individuals who exist at the boundary. They are not fully of one world or the other. They are comfortable in both. They have enough capital from the higher stratum to recognize and relate to someone like Nu, and enough embeddedness in the lower stratum to provide authentic social cover. These boundary individuals are, in network theory terms, weak ties that perform strong tie functions. They connect nodes that would otherwise be completely isolated from each other. Now hold that architecture in your mind, because I'm about to show you that Mariah Buckles' life is not analogous to this architecture. It is this architecture. The same structural components, the capital portfolio mismatch, the deployment into a scarce market, the bridge functions, the mimicry, the discovery risk, are all present. But there is a critical difference. In the film ATL, the capital arbitrage is portrayed as a personal choice, a deception, a secret that creates romantic tension. In Mariah Buckles' life, the capital arbitrage is not a choice. It is a systemic inevitability. The system, the specific configuration of DeKalb County's demographics, educational infrastructure, cultural production landscape, and proximity to Atlanta's entertainment economy, produced her as an individual whose capital portfolio was structurally destined to be deployed outside its intended pipeline. She did not choose to arbitrage her capital. The system left her no other option. Let me be precise about why. Mariah Buckles' capital portfolio, as it existed when she was a teenager in South DeKalb, contained the following components. First, academic ability sufficient to graduate from Southwest DeKalb a year early and earn a biology scholarship to an out-of-state university. This is institutional capital, the kind of capital that the formal education system recognizes, certifies, and rewards. Second, vocal and musical ability that had been cultivated, if not formally trained, through the cultural ecology of South DeKalb, a county adjacent to the megachurch tradition that produces church choir-trained vocalists, adjacent to DeKalb's performing arts infrastructure, and embedded in the broader Atlanta cultural landscape that was, during her adolescence, producing some of the most commercially successful hip-hop and R&B artists in American history. Third, code-switching fluency, the ability to shift linguistic registers, behavioral norms, and presentational styles to match the expectations of radically different social environments. Her father played saxophone. Her mother sang in church. She grew up in a black middle-class home in a predominantly black working-class community, attending a school where the cultural register was working-class black Atlanta, while the aspirational register pointed toward institutional advancement. That specific tension, living middle-class norms inside a working-class environment, is the crucible in which code-switching ability is forged, because the individual must constantly calibrate their presentation to match whichever context they are currently in. Fourth, and this is where the analysis becomes genuinely uncomfortable, because it involves speaking about physical appearance as a structural variable rather than as a personal attribute, which is the only honest way to analyze what is actually happening. Mariah Buckles possesses what the sociology of race and aesthetics would call dual register legibility. She is a black woman whose phenotypic presentation allows her to be read as authentically black in black spaces, while simultaneously being read as racially proximate to whiteness in white and institutional spaces. This is not about beauty in any abstract sense. It is about categorical legibility. the degree to which an individual's appearance triggers the categorization schemas that determine how they are treated in different social environments. In black spaces, particularly in the colorism dynamics that operate in black male social hierarchies, lighter skin and certain phenotypic configurations carry a specific form of social capital, not because of any inherent value, but because the system of racial hierarchy in America has, over centuries, constructed a premium on proximity to whiteness that persists even within black communities as an internalized valuation structure. In white institutional spaces, the same phenotypic configuration reduces the friction of entry. It triggers less racial threat response, less categorical othering, and more willingness to extend the benefit of the doubt. Mariah Buckles did not choose this configuration. It is a structural endowment, but it is real. It has measurable effects on social outcomes, and ignoring it in order to be polite would make the analysis dishonest. Fifth, she possessed what I will call proximity capital, the advantage of being geographically and culturally adjacent to one of the most productive entertainment ecosystems in America. DeKalb County borders Fulton County, which contains Atlanta proper. Zone 6, the area of East Atlanta that produced some of the most commercially dominant rappers of the 2010s, is not far from South DeKalb. The Dungeon Family, Outkast, T.Y., Gucci Mane, Future, Young Thug. The lineage of Atlanta's hip-hop dominance runs through neighborhoods that are within a short drive of where Mariah grew up. The football culture of DeKalb and Gwinnett counties, the HBCU band pipeline that Southwest DeKalb's own marching band fed into, the performing arts infrastructure, all of it created a cultural ecology in which musical and performative talent was not an aberration but an ambient possibility. She did not grow up in a cultural desert, she grew up in a cultural greenhouse. Now here is the key question. What is the optimal deployment strategy for this specific capital portfolio? Where does this exact combination of academic ability, musical talent, code-switching fluency, dual-register aesthetic legibility, and entertainment proximity generate the highest returns? The answer is emphatically not medicine. The medical pipeline rewards depth of scientific preparation, multi-year institutional endurance, and access to the tacit knowledge networks that guide applicants through a 13-year training process. Mariah had the intelligence, but not the infrastructure. The answer is also not the conventional white-collar professional pipeline, consulting, finance, corporate management. Those pathways reward educational pedigree from specific institutions, and St. John's University, while a perfectly respectable school, does not carry the signaling weight that McKinsey or Goldman Sachs recruiters are scanning for. The answer is also not academia, which rewards depth of specialization and tolerance for the decades-long apprenticeship model of graduate school and the tenure track. The answer, the only answer, when you honestly map her capital portfolio against every available marketplace, is the entertainment industry, specifically the R&B and hip-hop ecosystem, because that is the one marketplace in America where every single component of her capital portfolio simultaneously commands a premium. Her vocal ability is directly monetizable. Her code-switching fluency allows her to navigate both the street-coded social environments where artists live and the corporate-coded institutional environments where deals are made. Her aesthetic legibility gives her access to social spaces, specifically the social circles of successful black male artists that are gated not by credentials, but by cultural and physical presentation. Her institutional literacy gives her the ability to understand, even if she cannot personally negotiate, the contractual and business structures that govern the industry. And her proximity to Atlanta's entertainment infrastructure means she does not need to manufacture connections from scratch. The connections are ambient, waiting to be activated. The film ATL showed you the blueprint. A woman deploying affluent capital in a space that cannot detect its origin, using bridge functions to gain entry, and generating social returns that her home environment could never have produced. Mariah Buckles is the real-world iteration, but she did not have the luxury of choice that New had. New could go home, Mariah could not. The institutional pipeline she was designed for, pediatric anesthesiology, was structurally foreclosed by the qualitative deficiencies in her preparation that Southwest DeKalb could not have remedied no matter how talented she was. The pipeline rejected her, not because she was inadequate, but because the system that produced her was inadequate to the demands of the pipeline she was aimed at. And when that pipeline closed, the only remaining option was the one marketplace where her full capital portfolio, all 5 components operating simultaneously, could generate the returns that the medical pipeline never could have delivered. She did not fall into music. The system pushed her there. And the system that pushed her was set in motion by white families leaving South DeKalb in the 1980s, by property tax revenue declining in the 1990s, by the Crawford Lewis scandal hollowing out the school system in the 2000s, and by the specific configuration of cultural, economic, and demographic forces that made Atlanta's entertainment ecosystem the most accessible and most rewarding marketplace for a woman with her exact structural profile. Every step was determined. Every turn was inevitable. The only thing that looked like a choice was the moment she dropped out of St. John's during her junior year. And even that was not a choice. It was a structural correction, the system eliminating a mismatch and redirecting her toward the marketplace where her capital could actually be converted. This is not a story about a girl who chose music over medicine. This is a story about a system that could not hold the thing it produced. I need you to understand something about environments that most people never think about, because the data required to see it does not exist in any single place. When you drive through a neighborhood, you see the surface. You see houses, you see roads, you see commercial strips, you see schools, you see cars and driveways, and if you are perceptive, you can read some of the underlying economic reality from these surface signals. Older buildings mean deferred maintenance, mean constrained capital. The ratio of chain stores to independent businesses tells you about the purchasing power of the population and the degree to which national capital has deemed the area worth investing in. The physical condition of the school building gives you a hypothesis about the resources available. The make and model and age of the cars tell you about income levels and credit access. But here is what the surface cannot tell you. The surface cannot tell you the credit scores of the people who live there. It cannot tell you who has a lien holder on their car and who owns it outright. It cannot tell you the interest rates on the mortgages. It cannot tell you the insurance premiums, auto, home, health, and how those premiums interact with disposable income. It cannot tell you the student loan balances or the debt-to-income ratios. It cannot tell you who is one medical emergency away from bankruptcy and who has 6 months of savings. It cannot tell you the underwriting criteria that determined which families qualified for homes in this area and which were redirected elsewhere. All of that data exists. It exists in databases maintained by credit bureaus, insurance companies, mortgage servicers, auto lenders, and a constellation of financial institutions whose business depends on knowing exactly these things. But it exists in silos. No single entity holds the complete picture. And the people living inside the system, the families, the students, the workers, almost never have access to the aggregate view. They experience their individual data point. They know their own credit score, their own mortgage rate, their own insurance premium. They do not know the distribution. They do not know where they sit in the local statistical landscape. They do not know that the aggregate of all these individual data points forms a pattern that is more predictive of life outcomes than any personality trait, any talent, any ambition. I call this the fourth dimension of an environment. The first three dimensions are the physical landscape you can see, the built environment, the commercial infrastructure, the institutional footprint. The fourth dimension is the aggregate of all the financial, actuarial, and administrative data that is invisible to direct observation, but that determines, with far more precision than most people realize, what outcomes are available to the individuals who live there. The fourth dimension is where the system's pipelines become visible. It is where you can see not just what a neighborhood looks like, but what it allows people to become. And for South DeKalb, the fourth dimension tells a very specific story. Let me build it piece by piece. Start with housing. The homes in South DeKalb were built primarily in the 1960s and 70s for white middle-class families. When those families left during the white flight period, the homes were purchased by incoming black families at prices that reflected two opposing forces: the desirability of the physical structures themselves, which were solidly built and relatively spacious by suburban standards, and the declining demand from white buyers who were fleeing in the other direction. This created a brief window of relative affordability that allowed black families with moderate but not exceptional incomes to buy into neighborhoods that were, in physical terms, above their economic stratum. But here's the problem. Property taxes in Georgia are tied to assessed home values. As white flight depressed property values throughout the 1980s and 90s, the property tax revenue generated by South DeKalb declined relative to the northern part of the county, where values were rising. Property taxes fund schools. Lower property tax revenue means lower per pupil spending, which means fewer resources for teacher recruitment, facility maintenance, curriculum development, and extracurricular programming. DeKalb County's school district today spends approximately $16,200 per pupil, which is 13% above the national average. But that aggregate number obscures the internal distribution. The resources are not evenly allocated across the county. Schools in the northern, wealthier part of the county historically attracted better qualified teachers, had more active parent organizations that supplemented public funding with private donations, and benefited from a tax base that could support facility upgrades and technology investments. Schools in the southern part of the county, schools like Southwest DeKalb, relied more heavily on the district-level allocation and had fewer supplementary resources. The result was a qualitative gap within the same district. Two schools operating under the same administrative umbrella, carrying the same district name, offering the same course catalogs, but delivering fundamentally different educational experiences. Now layer on the insurance dimension. South DeKalb, as a majority black community with higher than average poverty rates, has historically faced elevated auto insurance premiums relative to comparable neighborhoods in the northern part of the county. Insurance companies use actuarial models that incorporate zip code as a variable, and zip codes in South DeKalb are associated with higher claim rates, higher rates of uninsured drivers, and other factors that translate into higher premiums. This is not speculation. Georgia's auto insurance market has been documented as exhibiting significant racial disparities in pricing, with predominantly black zip codes paying higher premiums, even after controlling for driving records and vehicle types. The effect is cumulative. A family in South DeKalb paying an additional $1,000 per year in auto insurance premiums relative to a comparable family in Dunwoody is a family with $1,000 fewer dollars available for educational supplementation, extracurricular activities, college savings, or any other investment that might expand their children's opportunity set. Multiply that by every family in the community, and the aggregate capital drain becomes significant. Layer on predatory lending. The 2000s saw a wave of subprime mortgage origination that disproportionately targeted communities exactly like South DeKalb, communities with moderate home values, populations with limited financial literacy relative to the complexity of the instruments being sold, and demographic compositions that correlated with fewer regulatory protections and less access to prime lending products. When the financial crisis hit in 2008, South DeKalb was devastated. Foreclosure rates spiked. Property values, which had already been suppressed by decades of demographic transition, fell further. The community experienced a wealth destruction event that erased years of home equity accumulation for families who had bought in during the initial post-white flight window. Mariah Buckles was 10 or 11 years old when this happened. She almost certainly did not understand the mechanics, but the effects were ambient. She would have seen homes in her community sitting empty, would have noticed changes in the economic texture of daily life, would have absorbed the generalized anxiety that accompanies a community-level financial shock. Layer on healthcare access. The hospital corridor in metropolitan Atlanta is concentrated in areas that serve higher-income populations. Grady Memorial Hospital serves as the safety net institution for much of South Atlanta and South DeKalb, but the concentration of specialized medical facilities, the kind that employ anesthesiologists, that train residents, that create the tacit exposure pipelines through which future doctors absorb the culture and expectations of medical practice, is weighted toward Emory University's medical complex, Northside Hospital, and the Piedmont Healthcare System, all of which are located in areas that are geographically and socially distant from South DeKalb. This matters because the pipeline to becoming a physician is not just academic, it is cultural. It requires proximity to the profession, shadowing opportunities, volunteer placements, mentorship from practicing physicians, exposure to the language and norms of medical culture. Students from affluent northern Atlanta suburbs encounter this culture through family connections, neighborhood proximity to hospitals, and school programs that facilitate clinical exposure. A student from South DeKalb encounters it as an abstraction, a career aspiration without the ambient infrastructure to support it. So here's the fourth dimension of South DeKalb as it existed during Mariah Buckles' formative years. A community with the physical appearance of suburban middle-class comfort. The houses were real, the school building was real, the AP course catalog was real, but with a financial and institutional substrate that was systematically undercutting the capacity of those physical structures to deliver the outcomes they were designed to deliver. The houses were real, but the equity was eroding. The school was real, but the teachers were stretched. The scandal was metastasizing. The accreditation was threatened. The AP classes were real, but the preparation they provided was qualitatively inferior to what the same course designation delivered in wealthier zip codes. The career aspirations were real. Pediatric anesthesiology is a real profession that a real person can pursue, but the pipeline infrastructure required to convert that aspiration into that career simply did not exist in the environment. This is what Samuel Lucas means by effectively maintained inequality. It is not that Mariah Buckles was denied access to education. She was not. She graduated early, she took AP classes, she earned a scholarship. By every quantitative metric, she accessed the educational system successfully. But the qualitative dimension, the actual rigor of the instruction she received, the tacit knowledge networks she had access to, the cultural preparation for the specific institutional environments she would need to navigate, was systematically inferior to what a student with equivalent intelligence and ambition would have received at, say, Johns Creek High School in Fulton County or Lambert High School in Forsyth County. The quantity was equal, the quality was not, and the quality gap was not an accident. It was the predictable downstream effect of the fourth dimensional data I just described. The property tax differentials, the insurance premium drains, the lending patterns, the healthcare access disparities, all of which conspired to create an environment that looked like it could produce a pediatric anesthesiologist, but structurally could not. Now, I want to connect this specifically to the schools, because the schools are the most visible institutional manifestation of the fourth dimension, and they are where the pipeline bottleneck becomes most concrete. Southwest DeKalb High School offers 3 academic tracks: college preparatory, honors, and advanced placement. In theory, these tracks provide stratified pathways calibrated to different levels of academic ambition and ability. In practice, at a school where 94% of the student body is Black and where functionally all students qualify for free or reduced lunch, the stratification between these tracks is compressed. The AP teachers are, in many cases, the same individuals teaching the honors sections. The class sizes are comparable, the laboratory resources, the library holdings, the technology infrastructure, all of it is shared across tracks, and all of it reflects the resource constraints of the district. A student taking AP chemistry at Southwest DeKalb is not receiving the same pedagogical experience as a student taking AP chemistry at Brookwood High School in Gwinnett County, where the tax base is different, the teacher recruitment pool is different, the parental supplementation is different, and the peer academic culture is different. And yet Southwest DeKalb has a real history of excellence. It was honored by the College Board in 2006 as a model for AP implementation. In 2011, it was one of only 14 schools nationally, and the only school in Georgia, recognized by the College Board for helping African American students succeed on AP exams. Its marching band performed at the 1996 Summer Olympics opening ceremonies and was featured in the 2002 film Drumline. Its football program has won numerous region titles and a state championship. Its track and field teams have won national championships. This is not a school without achievement. It is a school with extraordinary achievement within its constraints. But the constraints are real, and they are quantifiable, and they create a ceiling that even the most talented students cannot transcend without external supplementation, tutoring, test prep, mentorship, network access, that the environment does not reliably provide. When Mariah Buckles graduated from this school a year early, she was performing at the top of a compressed distribution. She was not performing at the top of the state distribution or the national distribution. The distinction matters enormously, because when she arrived at St. John's University on a biology scholarship and enrolled in what was presumably a pre-medical curriculum, she was entering a competitive environment where her peers had been prepared by systems operating under radically different fourth-dimensional conditions. Students from well-funded suburban schools in the Northeast, the kinds of schools that routinely send students to St. John's, had taken AP biology and AP chemistry classes taught by teachers with doctoral-level training, in laboratories equipped with current instrumentation, surrounded by peers who were also aiming at medical school and whose parents could provide the contextual knowledge about the application process. Mariah had the same AP designations on her transcript. She did not have the same preparation behind those designations. This is the violence that effectively maintained inequality inflicts, and it is a violence that leaves no visible wound. From the outside, from the perspective of a college admissions officer, Mariah Buckles looked like a star. Early graduation, biology scholarship, a P coursework, strong test scores presumably, or the scholarship would not have been offered. She looked like exactly the kind of student that a university's diversity recruitment efforts are designed to attract. A high-achieving Black woman from a historically underserved community who has demonstrated the resilience and ability to succeed despite structural disadvantage. But looking like a star and being structurally positioned to sustain stardom across a 13-year medical training pipeline are fundamentally different things. The admissions office saw the quantitative dimension, the grades, the test scores, the course names. It could not see the qualitative dimension, the gap between what those course names signified on her transcript and what they actually delivered in her classroom. That gap is where the pipeline failure originates, not in any personal deficiency, not in any lack of intelligence or determination. In a structural mismatch between the signals the system uses to evaluate potential and the actual preparation the system provided. Mariah Buckles arrived at St. John's University in Queens, New York, carrying this invisible deficit. And she carried something else, too, something that would ultimately prove far more consequential than any pre-medical curriculum. She carried the full weight of a capital portfolio that had been assembled by the specific structural conditions of South DeKalb, a portfolio that included, as I detailed in the previous section, academic ability, musical talent, code-switching fluency, dual-register aesthetic legibility, and entertainment proximity capital. She carried all of this into a city, New York, that functions as a fundamentally different kind of social marketplace than Atlanta, one where the specific configuration of her capital would encounter entirely new scarcity profiles and entirely new deployment opportunities. And she carried the existential tension of being a person whose system had positioned her for a destination she could not reach without yet knowing what destination she was actually positioned for. What happens to a person in that position? Structurally overqualified for their origin environment, structurally underqualified for their aspiration, and carrying a capital portfolio that is optimized for a marketplace they have not yet discovered, is the subject of the next section. But I want to close this section with a principle that I believe has never been formally articulated, and that emerges directly from the analysis of both the ATL blueprint and the Mariah Buckles case study. The principle is this: in any society with stratified environments that are geographically proximate, environments where different classes, different capital profiles, and different institutional access levels exist within commuting distance of each other, the system will inevitably produce individuals whose capital portfolios do not match any single environment's pipeline. These individuals are not failures, they are not aberrations, they are structural outputs. The system produces them as reliably as it produces the individuals who fit neatly into pipelines. The difference is that the system has names for the individuals who fit: student, employee, professional, executive, and no name for the individuals who do not. The individuals who do not fit are legible to no single institution, but potentially valuable to every informal marketplace that exists in the gaps between institutions. They are the system's excess production. And in a society where the informal marketplaces are expanding, where entertainment, social media, influencer culture, and the attention economy are growing faster than institutional pipelines can absorb new entrants, these structurally liminal individuals are not marginal, they are increasingly central. Mariah Buckles is one of them. And the system that made her, DeKalb County, its schools, its demographics, its fourth-dimensional data infrastructure, is producing more of them every year. They just do not have a name yet, until now. When Mariah Buckles arrived at St. John's University in Queens, New York, sometime around 2013 or 2014, she was doing something that the institutional system regards as a success story. A black woman from South DeKalb, graduating high school a year early, earning a biology scholarship, traveling 1,400 miles to pursue a career in medicine. By every metric the system uses to evaluate itself, enrollment numbers, scholarship distribution, diversity percentages, her presence at St. John's was evidence that the pipeline was working. Admissions officers could point to her and say, the system found this talented young woman in an underserved community and gave her an opportunity. The pipeline is working, the system is functioning, and they would be completely wrong, because what the system was actually doing was setting up a collision between the capital portfolio Mariah carried and the capital requirements of the environment she was entering. And that collision, when it came, would not look like a system failure. It would look like a personal decision. It would look like a girl changing her mind about medicine. It would look like choice. But it was not choice. It was physics. It was the inevitable result of forces that were set in motion long before she boarded the plane. St. John's University is a private Catholic university in the Jamaica neighborhood of Queens. It is not an elite institution by the metrics that medical school admissions committees weight most heavily. It does not carry the prestige of a Columbia or a Johns Hopkins or even a Stony Brook in the SUNY system. But it is a real university with real pre-medical tracks and real graduates who go on to medical careers. The question is not whether St. John's can produce doctors. It can. The question is what configuration of preparation, support, and tacit knowledge a student needs to successfully navigate the pre-medical curriculum at St. John's and emerge competitive for medical school admission. And this is where the fourth dimension of South DeKalb catches up with Mariah Buckles. A pre-medical curriculum at any American university is designed as a filtering mechanism. Its function is not primarily educational. Its function is to identify which students can withstand the cognitive and emotional demands of medical training. The introductory courses, general chemistry, organic chemistry, biology, physics, calculus, are deliberately rigorous, deliberately fast-paced, and deliberately unforgiving. They are designed to produce a bimodal distribution, a group of students who can keep up and a group who cannot. The students who can keep up are disproportionately students who arrived with genuine mastery of the prerequisite material, not the surface-level familiarity that a course designation on a transcript implies, but the deep, flexible, problem-solving competence that comes from rigorous instruction and extensive practice. The students who cannot keep up are disproportionately students who arrived with the transcript but not the substance. Students whose AP chemistry course covered the same topics as an AP chemistry course at a well-funded suburban school, but did not achieve the same depth, the same rigor, the same density of practice problems, the same quality of laboratory experience. Mariah Buckles, based on everything we know about the structural conditions of her preparation, was almost certainly in the second group, not because of any deficiency in her intelligence. Her early graduation and scholarship demonstrate that her raw cognitive ability was exceptional. But raw cognitive ability is necessary and not sufficient for surviving a pre-medical curriculum. What is also required is a specific kind of preparation, the kind that fills in the gap between knowing a concept and being able to apply it under pressure, the kind that builds the automaticity in chemical equation, balancing, and mathematical problem solving that allows a student to move through exam questions at the pace the exam demands. This kind of preparation is a function of instructional quality, practice volume, and peer environment, all of which are downstream products of the fourth dimensional conditions I described in the previous section. Southwest DeKalb could give Mariah the course names. It could not give her the preparation depth. But there is a second dimension of the pipeline failure that is equally important and far less discussed. The pre-medical track is not just an academic gauntlet. It is a social environment with its own culture, its own norms, and its own tacit knowledge infrastructure. Students who successfully navigate it do not do so in isolation. They form study groups. They share information about which professors are lenient, which exams are hardest, which research opportunities will strengthen a medical school application. They receive guidance from older students who have already navigated the process. They receive advice from family members who are physicians. They absorb, through 1,000 informal interactions, the unwritten rules that govern success in the system. This tacit knowledge infrastructure is not equally distributed. It concentrates around students whose social backgrounds give them pre-existing access to it. Students whose parents are doctors, whose older siblings attended medical school, whose high school guidance counselors had experience advising pre-med students. A first-generation college student from South DeKalb, arriving at St. John's with an aspiration to become a pediatric anesthesiologist, does not have this infrastructure. She has the aspiration. She does not have the map. Now, I need you to hold two realities simultaneously, because this is where the analysis gets genuinely complex. Reality one is the academic and institutional pressure that was bearing down on Mariah at St. John's, the pre-medical coursework that was revealing the preparation gap, the tacit knowledge deficit, the social isolation of being a black woman from Atlanta, navigating a campus in Queens that, despite its diversity, would have offered a fundamentally different cultural landscape than the one she grew up in. Reality two is the capital portfolio she was carrying, the musical ability, the code-switching fluency, the aesthetic legibility, the cultural sensibility. That was, in the context of the pre-medical pipeline, completely irrelevant. The pipeline did not value those things. The pipeline valued organic chemistry problem sets and research experience and MCAT preparation, everything that made Mariah structurally interesting, everything that would eventually make her career, was dead weight in the pre-medical environment. Worse than dead weight. It was a distraction, because those capabilities, unlike organic chemistry, had an immediately available market. And this is the mechanism I want to name, because it is the engine that drives the entire trajectory. I call it positional liquidity conversion. Here's what it means. Every individual carries a portfolio of capital, skills, attributes, credentials, social connections, cultural competencies, aesthetic properties, that has different liquidity in different markets. Liquidity, in financial terms, is the ease with which an asset can be converted into value. Cash is perfectly liquid. It can be converted into anything immediately. A house is illiquid. Converting it into value requires time, a buyer, and a transaction process. The same logic applies to personal capital. Academic credentials are liquid in the institutional market. They can be converted into admissions, scholarships, employment, but illiquid in the entertainment market, where no one cares about your GPA. Conversely, vocal ability and aesthetic presentation are liquid in the entertainment market. They can be immediately converted into social access, performance opportunities, and eventually recording contracts, but illiquid in the institutional market, where they carry no credential weight. What makes Mariah Buckles' case structurally remarkable is that she possessed a capital portfolio with extremely high liquidity in a market she had not yet entered, and extremely low liquidity in the market she was currently navigating. Her pre-medical credentials, her biology scholarship, her coursework, were becoming increasingly illiquid as the preparation gap revealed itself. Meanwhile, her entertainment-adjacent capital, her voice, her cultural fluency, her presentation, was sitting unused, appreciating in potential value as the entertainment market around her continued to expand. She was holding an asset that was losing value in one market, while simultaneously holding an asset that was gaining value in a different market. The rational move, from a pure capital optimization standpoint, was obvious. Liquidate the depreciating asset and deploy the appreciating one. But human beings do not make decisions through pure capital optimization. They make decisions through identity, emotion, social pressure, and internalized scripts about what constitutes success and failure. Mariah's internalized script, absorbed from her middle-class family, her academic environment, and the broader cultural narrative about what a smart black woman is supposed to do, said that medicine was success and music was risk. Dropping out of a pre-medical program to pursue music was, in the terms of that script, a failure. It did not matter that the structural conditions made the pre-medical path objectively suboptimal for her specific capital portfolio. The script said otherwise. And so the transition, when it came, would have been experienced not as a rational reallocation of capital, but as a crisis, a loss of identity, a confrontation with the gap between aspiration and structural possibility, a reckoning with the fact that the system that raised her had aimed her at a target she was never equipped to hit. This is the cruelty of effectively maintained inequality at the individual level. It does not just produce unequal outcomes, it produces unequal experiences of those outcomes. A student from an affluent background who decides to leave a pre-medical track to pursue music is making a lifestyle choice. Their family has the resources to absorb the risk. Their social network includes people who have succeeded through unconventional paths. Their decision is framed by themselves and others as brave, creative, entrepreneurial. A student from South DeKalb who makes the same decision is making what feels like an existential gamble. Their family has invested scarce resources in the scholarship. Their social network may include no one who has successfully monetized creative talent. Their decision is framed by themselves and potentially by their family as giving up. The structural conditions are different, the decision is different, but from the outside, both decisions look the same. Both look like choice. Mariah has spoken in interviews about the difficulty of telling her parents about her decision to drop out. She has described them as initially hesitant about her veering from a traditional academic path. This hesitance was not irrational. It was the perfectly rational response of a black middle-class family that understood from direct experience how narrow the margin of error is for people in their structural position. The scholarship was real money. The degree was a real credential. The career path was a real pipeline to economic security. Abandoning all of it for something as uncertain as a music career in an industry known for exploitation, short careers, and the systematic extraction of value from artists who lack institutional literacy was terrifying. The parents were not wrong to be afraid. They were processing the same structural analysis I have been presenting, except they were processing it not as an intellectual exercise, but as a lived reality with their daughter's future at stake. But here is what Mariah's parents could not have known, because the data required to see it does not exist in any accessible form. They could not have known that their daughter's capital portfolio was, by the metrics that actually determine success in the entertainment industry, extraordinarily well configured. They could not have known that the code-switching ability she developed, navigating South DeKalb's compressed class structure, would be directly convertible into the ability to move between the street-coded social environments of hip-hop culture and the corporate-coded environments of record label negotiations. They could not have known that her dual register aesthetic legibility would give her access to social spaces that are gated by visual presentation rather than credentials. They could not have known that the cultural sensibilities she absorbed from growing up in Atlanta's musical ecosystem, the proximity to hip-hop production culture, the church choir tradition, the performing arts infrastructure, had given her an intuitive understanding of what makes a song work that no pre-medical curriculum could have provided. They saw their daughter giving up a certain path for an uncertain one. What they could not see was that the certain path was already structurally foreclosed, and that the uncertain path was, given her specific capital configuration, far less uncertain than it appeared. Now let me trace the actual mechanics of how the transition happened, because the mechanics reveal something important about how positional liquidity conversion works in practice. According to the biographical record, Mariah began writing songs in her dorm room at St. John's. This is significant. She did not begin performing at open mic nights. She did not begin networking with music industry contacts. She began writing privately, in a space that was nominally designated for academic work. The creative impulse found its way into the gap that the academic demands could not fill. She has described her early songwriting as beginning with poems, which suggests that the initial creative output was literary rather than musical, and that the musical dimension emerged as the poems sought a more complete form of expression. One version of the story says she recorded her first songs as a Valentine's Day gift for a then-boyfriend. If this is accurate, it means that the initial deployment of her musical capital was not commercial or strategic. It was personal. It was an intimate act that happened to produce an artifact, a recorded song, that could then be evaluated, shared, and ultimately uploaded to a platform where it could reach a wider audience. That platform was SoundCloud. In January of 2018, Mariah released her debut EP, a 6-track project called To Die For, independently on SoundCloud. This is a critical juncture in the capital conversion process, because SoundCloud in 2018 was the single most efficient marketplace for converting raw musical talent into industry attention. The platform's algorithm and discovery mechanics rewarded exactly the kind of output Mariah could produce: intimate, emotionally direct R&B that demonstrated vocal ability and songwriting sophistication without requiring the production budgets or distribution infrastructure of a major label. SoundCloud was, in capital arbitrage terms, the market where her specific musical capital was most liquid. She did not need a record deal to access it. She did not need industry connections. She needed a recording device, an internet connection, and enough musical ability to produce something that would stand out in the feed. She had all three, and it worked. The EP caught the attention of Tory Lanez. Now, Tory Lanez, born Daystar Peterson, is a Canadian rapper, singer, and producer who at the time was operating at a particular position in the hip-hop ecosystem. He was commercially successful, musically versatile, and actively building a label infrastructure, One Umbrella Records in partnership with RCA Records, that needed artists. His discovery of Mariah on SoundCloud was not magical. It was the predictable result of an artist with a growing label scanning the most efficient talent discovery platform for artists whose profiles matched the aesthetic and commercial positioning he was seeking. Mariah's profile, a young black woman from Atlanta with vocal ability, R&B sensibility, and an aesthetic presentation that was commercially viable, was a near-perfect match for what a label like One Umbrella would be looking for. The discovery felt serendipitous. It was algorithmic. The platform connected supply to demand. But the Tory Lanez connection is structurally significant for a reason beyond the commercial opportunity it provided. Lanez, as a figure in the hip-hop ecosystem, occupied a specific social node. He was connected to other artists, producers, label executives, and cultural gatekeepers across the entertainment industry. By signing with one umbrella and going on tour with Lanez, Mariah was not just launching a music career, she was gaining access to a social network that would have been completely inaccessible through her previous institutional position. The network included other artists on the RCA Records roster. It included concert promoters and booking agents. It included the social ecosystem of the music industry's mid-tier, not the rarefied heights of established superstars, but the productive middle ground where emerging artists build audiences, refine their sound, and develop the professional relationships that determine long-term career trajectory. And here is where the positional liquidity conversion reaches its most powerful phase. Because once Mariah was inside that network, every component of her capital portfolio became simultaneously liquid. Her vocal ability generated income through performances and recordings. Her code-switching fluency allowed her to navigate the diverse social environments of the music industry, from studio sessions with street-coded producers to meetings with corporate label executives. Her institutional literacy, however informal, gave her an advantage in understanding the business structures that many artists from more disadvantaged backgrounds could not parse. Her aesthetic legibility opened social doors that were gated by visual presentation, and her cultural sensibility, the product of growing up in Atlanta's musical ecosystem, gave her the intuitive understanding of genre conventions and audience expectations that allowed her to position her music effectively within the R&B landscape. The capital that was dead weight in the pre-medical pipeline was now fully activated. Every element of who she was, every element that the institutional system could not value, could not credential, could not place within a pipeline, was suddenly generating returns. This is positional liquidity conversion in its purest form. The capital did not change, the market changed, and the returns were outsized precisely because the entertainment market was starved of the specific capital combination she possessed. There were plenty of vocally talented young women in the R&B space. There were far fewer who combined vocal ability with institutional literacy, code-switching fluency, aesthetic dual legibility, and the specific cultural sensibility of a black middle-class woman from post-white flight South DeKalb. The scarcity of that combination was what generated the premium. And the premium was not just monetary, though the monetary returns eventually came, through album sales, streaming royalties, touring revenue, and brand partnerships. The premium was positional. It placed her in a specific location within the entertainment ecosystem's social network, where her combination of attributes made her not just commercially viable, but structurally indispensable. Indispensable to whom? That is the question that opens the next section. Because the entertainment ecosystem is not a neutral marketplace where all participants transact on equal terms. It is a stratified system with its own class structure, its own forms of exploitation, and its own invisible architecture. And within that system, Mariah Buckles's capital portfolio was about to find its most consequential deployment, not as a solo artist, but as a structural bridge between two worlds that were never designed to communicate. Her debut album, Master, was released on August 23, 2019, entirely produced by Tory Lanez. It featured 10 tracks, including the singles Beetlejuice and Reminders. The album received positive critical attention. NPR featured Beetlejuice in its Heat Check Weekly Roundup, and the music video for Reminders premiered on Complex. These are not Billboard Hot 100 placements. They are mid-tier indicators of critical viability and industry interest. They are the markers of an artist who has successfully converted her capital into a foothold in the marketplace, who has demonstrated enough commercial potential to warrant continued investment from a label, and who is now positioned to begin the second phase of career development, building an audience, refining a brand, and navigating the industry's relationship structures. But Master was produced by Tory Lanez. And Tory Lanez, as the world would later learn in graphic and disturbing detail, was a figure whose relationship with black women in the music industry was marked by exploitation and violence. In July of 2020, Lanez shot Megan Thee Stallion in both feet during an altercation in the Hollywood Hills, an act for which he was eventually convicted in December 2022 and sentenced to 10 years in prison. The details of Lanez's relationship with Mariah during the period of her debut album remain unclear. Some sources have speculated that they were romantically involved. Neither has confirmed this publicly. What is clear is that the professional dynamic, an emerging female artist whose entire debut album is produced by a single male figure who also serves as her label head and industry sponsor, is a power structure with well-documented potential for exploitation. The music industry is littered with the careers of women who entered through the sponsorship of a more powerful male figure and found that the sponsorship came with strings that were not visible at the point of entry. Whether those strings existed in Mariah's case is not something I can determine from the available evidence, and I'm not going to speculate beyond what the structural analysis supports. What I can say is that the Tory Lanez chapter of Mariah's career represents a specific instance of a broader structural pattern. the entry tax that the entertainment industry extracts from emerging artists, particularly black women, who lack the institutional infrastructure to enter the market independently. The entry tax is paid not in money, but in autonomy. The artist surrenders creative control, commercial leverage, and often personal boundaries in exchange for the access, production resources, and distribution infrastructure that the sponsoring figure provides. This is not unique to Mariah. It is endemic to the industry. But it is relevant to the structural analysis because it demonstrates that positional liquidity conversion is not frictionless. The capital is converted, but the conversion process itself extracts a toll. By 2021, Mariah had left both One Umbrella Records and RCA Records. She signed a new joint venture deal with Epic Records. In an interview with Billboard, she described the decision in terms that reveal a sophisticated understanding of her own positional needs. She said she was reluctant to sign any new deal, but was excited to find a partner that understood her as an artist and had the infrastructure to support her in the ways she needed most. This language, infrastructure, support, understanding, is the language of someone who has experienced the entry tax and is now negotiating from a position of greater knowledge about how the system works. She is no longer the biology scholarship student who stumbled into music. She is an artist with a debut album, critical recognition, and enough industry experience to evaluate label deals on terms that reflect her actual needs. The capital conversion is maturing. The liquidity is deepening. And it is precisely at this moment, at the inflection point between the Tory Lanez chapter and the next phase of her career, that Mariah Buckles enters the social orbit of Jeffrey Lamar Williams. Young thug, the man whose structural position in the American entertainment system represents the exact inverse of everything Mariah Buckles is, and whose needs, as a result, would make her not just a romantic partner, but a structural necessity. I need to talk about something that nobody in the public conversation about Mariah the scientist has ever articulated, because articulating it requires holding together a set of analytical tools that no single commentator typically possesses. It requires understanding the structural position of black male artists in the American entertainment industry, not their cultural position, which is endlessly discussed, but their structural position, which is almost never discussed. It requires understanding what the carceral state actually is as an economic pipeline rather than as a moral category. It requires understanding how the entertainment industry's exploitation mechanisms interact with the institutional literacy deficit that characterizes artists from specific backgrounds. And it requires understanding that what presents as a romantic relationship between two individuals in the public eye is, at the structural level, a transaction in a marketplace with no formal price discovery, no contract terms, and no language for what is being exchanged. Let me start with the structural position of the black male artist in hip-hop. And I want to be precise about this, because imprecision here leads to either romanticization or condemnation, and both are analytically useless. A significant proportion of the most commercially successful rappers in the last 2 decades, and I'm talking about artists whose music generates hundreds of millions of streams, whose tours gross tens of millions of dollars, whose cultural influence extends into fashion, language, and behavioral norms for an entire generation, come from environments that are structurally defined by what I am going to call carceral adjacency. This means they were born into communities where the primary institutional pipeline for young men was not Deloitte or McKinsey or the Google product management track. The primary institutional pipeline was the criminal justice system. The school-to-prison pipeline is not a metaphor. It is a literal description of the institutional pathway that connects under-resourced schools to juvenile detention to adult incarceration. The communities that produce the most commercially successful rappers are, in many cases, the same communities that produce the highest incarceration rates. This is not a coincidence. It is a structural relationship. Now here is the part that almost nobody says, because saying it requires a level of analytical honesty that makes people uncomfortable. The music industry does not extract these artists from their structural position. It monetizes their structural position. When a rapper from Zone 6 in Atlanta, or from Bankhead, or from the East Side makes music about drug dealing, violence, incarceration, and survival in environments defined by material scarcity and institutional abandonment, that music is not an escape from the structural position. It is the structural position converted into a cultural product. The record label does not sign the artist despite their background. The record label signs the artist because of their background. The authenticity of the experience, the fact that the artist has actually lived the conditions they describe, is the commercial asset. It is what distinguishes the music from fiction. It is what generates the emotional resonance that drives streams. It is what makes the artist legible to the audience. This creates a paradox that is central to understanding the entertainment ecosystem that Mariah Buckles entered. The rapper is simultaneously rewarded for his structural position and trapped by it. He is rewarded because the market pays a premium for authenticity, for music that sounds like it comes from real experience rather than imagination. He is trapped because the behavioral patterns, social networks, and decision-making frameworks that made him authentic in the first place do not evaporate when the record deal arrives. The friends he grew up with are still in the streets. The conflict resolution norms he internalized are still physical rather than legal. The relationship to institutions, to banks, to attorneys, to contracts, to the legal system is still adversarial rather than navigational. The record deal gives him money. It does not give him institutional literacy. And the system that surrounds him, the label, the management company, the publishing entity, the touring apparatus, is designed to extract value from him, and its ability to extract that value is directly proportional to his inability to understand the mechanisms of extraction. Think about what this means in concrete terms. A rapper signs a recording contract. The contract is a complex legal instrument with provisions for royalty splits, recoupment schedules, option clauses, and intellectual property assignments that even an entertainment attorney needs hours to parse. The rapper, who may have a 9th grade reading level, who has never read a legal document, who has no family member or trusted advisor with legal training, signs the contract because the alternative, not signing, not getting the advance, not escaping the conditions that produced him, is intolerable. He signs because the immediate reward is tangible and the future cost is abstract. And the future cost, when it arrives, is devastating. He discovers that the advance was a loan, not a gift, and that it must be recouped from his royalties before he earns another dollar. He discovers that the label owns his masters, the original recordings of his music, in perpetuity. He discovers that the option clause allows the label to extend the deal for additional albums at terms that are increasingly unfavorable. He discovers all of this after it is too late to change it. This is not an anomaly. This is the system working as designed. The entertainment industry's business model, in its most extractive form, depends on the institutional literacy deficit of its most commercially valuable artists. The less the artist understands about contracts, royalty structures, and intellectual property law, the more value the intermediaries, the label, the manager, the publisher, can capture. And the artists with the deepest institutional literacy deficits are precisely the artists from the environments with the highest carceral adjacency, because those environments produce the least exposure to the institutional norms that would provide a defense. Now enter Mariah Buckles into this ecosystem, and understand why she is not just a romantic partner or a musical collaborator, but a structural intervention in this dynamic. Remember her capital portfolio? She is a woman who graduated from high school a year early. She earned a biology scholarship to a university in New York. She navigated a pre-medical curriculum, however incompletely, which means she has exposure to the norms of institutional discipline, reading dense material, meeting deadlines, operating within bureaucratic structures. She code switches fluently between black vernacular registers and institutional English. She has lived in both South DeKalb and Queens. She has experienced the entertainment industry from the inside. She has signed with labels. She has left labels. She has negotiated new deals. She has, through direct experience, absorbed a working understanding of how the industry operates. She is, in other words, one of the only people in the social orbit of men like Young Thug who possesses simultaneous fluency in both the cultural register these men inhabit and the institutional register that governs the systems extracting value from them. She is culturally legible. She can move through black social spaces with the authenticity and ease that comes from having grown up in them. And she is institutionally literate. She can read a contract, she can ask the right questions, she can sense when the terms are exploitative, she can navigate the bureaucratic norms of the business side of entertainment. This combination is extraordinarily rare, because the pipeline that produces cultural legibility and the pipeline that produces institutional literacy are, in America's stratified system, almost completely separate. People who grow up in environments that produce rappers do not typically develop institutional literacy. People who develop institutional literacy do not typically maintain cultural legibility in those environments. The two capabilities are produced by different structural conditions, and the structural conditions are geographically, economically, and socially segregated. This is what I call structural liminality advantage. It is the condition in which an individual's inability to be fully categorized by any single system, neither fully institutional nor fully counter-institutional, neither fully of one social world nor fully of another, becomes itself a form of capital. The system has no pipeline for such individuals. It has no name for them. It has no credentialing mechanism that certifies their value. And yet their value is immense, precisely because they can do something that no one else in the ecosystem can do. They can translate. They can sit in a room with a record label executive and understand what the executive is actually saying beneath the corporate language. They can sit in a room with a rapper facing a RICO charge and understand the emotional and cultural dimensions of the crisis that a lawyer cannot access. They can move between these rooms without losing legibility in either one. They are interpreters in a world where the two languages, institutional and counter-institutional, were never designed to be translated. Young Thug, Jeffrey Lamar Williams, represents perhaps the most extreme case of the structural position I described. He is one of the most innovative and commercially successful rappers of his generation. His influence on the sound, fashion, and cultural norms of contemporary hip-hop is almost impossible to overstate. He is also a man who was arrested in May of 2022 and charged under Georgia's RICO statute alongside 27 co-defendants in what became the longest criminal trial in Georgia history. The prosecution alleged that Young Thug's record label, YSL, which stands for Young Stoner Life, but which prosecutors alleged was also an abbreviation for Young Slime Life, a criminal street gang, operated as a criminal enterprise responsible for murder, armed robbery, drug dealing, and a litany of other offenses. Young Thug faced up to 25 years in prison. He was incarcerated for approximately 2.5 years before accepting a plea deal in October of 2024. The RICO case is the most dramatic illustration of the structural position I described, the position in which the artist is simultaneously rewarded for and trapped by the conditions that produced him. Young Thug's music was commercially successful because it emerged from an authentic experience of life in Atlanta's street culture. His label, YSL, Young Stoner Life, carried a name that deliberately blurred the line between a legitimate music business and the street organization that prosecutors alleged it actually was. The blurring was not accidental, it was the commercial product. The authenticity of the connection between the music, the brand, and the street was what made YSL culturally powerful, and that same connection was what made it legally vulnerable. Now consider what Mariah Buckles represented to a man in this position. Not romantically. I am not making claims about the emotional dynamics of their relationship, which are personal and not mine to analyze. Structurally. What she represented, structurally, was something that Young Thug almost certainly did not have access to in any other relationship. A partner who could understand both sides of his existence simultaneously. She could understand the cultural world he came from because she was raised in a black environment in Atlanta and possesses the cultural fluency to be legible in that world. And she could understand the institutional world he was being consumed by, the legal system, the courtroom proceedings, the contractual obligations, the media dynamics, because her own capital portfolio included the institutional literacy that his did not. I am not suggesting that Mariah was acting as his attorney. She was not. I am not suggesting she was providing formal legal or business advice. There is no evidence of that. What I am suggesting is something more subtle and more structurally significant. I am suggesting that her ambient presence, what I call ambient institutional fluency, reduced the friction between Young Thug and the institutional systems he was forced to navigate. Not through any specific act of service, but through the way she existed in proximity to him. The questions she might ask that he would not think to ask. The norms she modeled that he had never been exposed to. The simple fact of having a partner who could read a legal document and explain what it meant in terms he could understand, who could attend a court hearing and process what was happening at the institutional level rather than only at the emotional level, who could interface with attorneys and label executives in their own language while still being fully present in his world. This is not the kind of value that shows up on a balance sheet. It is not the kind of value that gets credited in a feature article or a Wikipedia biography. It is invisible value. Value that exists in the margin between what would have happened without her presence and what happened with it. And it is value that, in the specific ecosystem of elite black male artists, navigating the intersection of enormous commercial success and profound institutional vulnerability, is almost uniquely rare. Because finding someone who can perform this function requires finding someone who was produced by a very specific set of structural conditions, the conditions I have been describing throughout this analysis. It requires someone from a black middle-class family in a post-white flight suburban environment with both the lingering institutional infrastructure of the previous population and the cultural density of the incoming population. It requires someone who navigated an education system that was simultaneously prestigious and structurally inadequate. It requires someone who entered and exited the institutional pipeline and the entertainment pipeline, absorbing the norms of both without being fully captured by either. It requires, in other words, someone produced by exactly the system that produced Mariah Buckles. This is why I said at the beginning that her emergence was not a career. It was an inevitability. The system needed someone in this structural position. The conditions of South DeKalb, the demographics of Atlanta, the specific historical moment of post-white flight institutional transition, all of it conspired to produce an individual whose capital portfolio was precisely configured to fill a structural need that the entertainment ecosystem could not articulate and could not fulfill through any formal mechanism. There is no job posting for the role Mariah Buckles performs. There is no credential that certifies it. There is no pipeline that produces it deliberately. It is produced accidentally by the friction between systems that were never designed to interact, in the bodies of individuals who happened to be positioned at the contact point. She attended his court hearings. She visited him weekly during his incarceration. She spoke publicly about their relationship in terms that confused and sometimes angered observers, calling him her man, leading concert audiences in chants of Free Thug, describing how she would drive 30 minutes to DeKalb County Jail just to see him through a virtual visit. The public read this as devotion. It is devotion, but it is also structural positioning. Whether consciously or not, Mariah's visible, unwavering presence during Young Thug's RICO trial performed a specific function. It signaled to the institutional world, the media, the legal system, the label, the public, that this man was not only a defendant in a criminal case, he was also a person embedded in a relationship with a woman who was herself institutionally legible. Her presence at the trial was a form of character testimony that did not require taking the stand. It said, someone who can navigate your world, someone who graduated early, who went to university, who speaks your institutional language, has chosen to stand beside this man. That signal has value. It does not exonerate, but it complicates the narrative of criminality that the prosecution was constructing. It introduces a dimension that the legal system has no formal mechanism for processing, but that jurors, judges, and the public process intuitively. Young Thug was released on October 31st, 2024, after accepting a plea deal. In December of that year, during a concert in Atlanta, he proposed to Mariah on stage. She accepted. Their engagement was a public event, witnessed by thousands and covered by every major music outlet. It was celebrated as a love story, a couple reunited after the tribulation of incarceration. And it is a love story. But it is also the conclusion of a capital transaction that began decades earlier in the fourth-dimensional data infrastructure of South DeKalb, when the structural conditions that would produce both Mariah Buckles and her value in the entertainment ecosystem were being assembled by forces that neither she nor anyone else could see. Later, in 2025, their relationship ended. Young Thug confirmed the breakup during a live stream, indicating that Mariah had been the one to end it. Leaked jail calls had previously revealed infidelity on his part during his incarceration. The personal dimensions of their separation are theirs, but the structural dimension is this: the same capital portfolio that made Mariah valuable to Young Thug, her institutional literacy, her ability to navigate multiple registers, her understanding of both sides of the system, also gave her the capacity to evaluate the relationship itself and to determine that the returns were no longer sufficient to justify the investment. The same mechanism that brought her into his orbit gave her the tools to leave it. Positional liquidity conversion works in both directions. Capital can be deployed, capital can also be withdrawn. I have been building an argument about systems and structures and invisible architectures, and I need to bring it down now to the level of the body, to the voice, to the way a person speaks and moves and presents themselves in a room, because the frameworks I have been constructing, positional liquidity conversion, structural liminality advantage, ambient institutional fluency, are not abstractions floating above the material world. They are enacted through specific physical and behavioral mechanisms, and the most important of those mechanisms, the one that makes everything else possible, is code switching. Not code switching as it is usually discussed as a quirky cultural phenomenon, a topic for a Vox explainer or a lighthearted panel at a diversity conference. Code switching as capital infrastructure. Code switching as the operating system that allows a single individual to function as a node connecting multiple social networks that were never designed to communicate with each other. Mariah Buckles operates in at least 4 distinct linguistic and behavioral registers, and the precision with which she can shift between them is not a personality trait. It is an emergent capability produced by the structural conditions of her upbringing, and it is the single most important asset in her capital portfolio. More important than her voice, more important than her physical appearance, more important than any of the other components I have described, because without code-switching fluency, none of the other components can be deployed. You can have the most extraordinary voice in the world, but if you cannot navigate the social environment where that voice can be monetized, the voice is worthless. Code switching is what allows navigation. It is the transportation infrastructure of her capital portfolio. The first register is what I will call the institutional register. This is standard American English spoken with the formal cadence and vocabulary of professional and academic environments. It is the register in which one speaks to a university admissions officer, a record label executive, a journalist conducting a formal interview, or an attorney reviewing a contract. It is characterized by complete sentences, precise vocabulary, an absence of slang, and a tonal quality that communicates competence, seriousness, and familiarity with institutional norms. Mariah's ability to operate in this register is a direct product of her middle-class family background, a father who works in real estate, where client-facing communication requires professional register, a mother in finance management, where institutional communication is a daily requirement, and her educational trajectory through the AP track at Southwest DeKalb and into St. John's University. She has spent enough time in institutional environments to have absorbed the register as a native mode. She does not perform it, she inhabits it. The second register is the Black Atlanta feminine vernacular. This is the sociolect specific to Black women in metropolitan Atlanta, characterized by particular phonological features, vowel shifts, consonant cluster reductions, intonation patterns that carry social and emotional information through melody rather than vocabulary, and by a vocabulary that draws from African American vernacular English while incorporating the specific regional markers of Atlanta speech. Within this register, there are further gradations. There is the register of Black women from affluent environments like Cascade or Buckhead, which tends to be more modulated, more polished, carrying what linguists call a reduced phonological distance from the institutional register. And there is the register of black women from working class environments like South DeKalb or East Atlanta, which is more phonologically distinct, more rhythmically assertive, and more immediately legible as authentic within street-coded social spaces. Mariah, having grown up in a middle-class family within a working-class environment, has access to the full range. She can modulate her position on this continuum with precision, moving toward the more polished end when the social context demands it, and toward the more assertive end when authenticity in street-coded spaces is what the moment requires. The third register is what I will call the Southern Feminine Register. This overlaps with the institutional register in its politeness, conventions, and with the Black Atlanta vernacular in its phonological features, but it occupies a distinct social space. It is the register in which a black woman from the South speaks to white Southerners, to bank tellers, to school administrators, to the white parents at a mixed-race social gathering, to the staff at a medical office. It is characterized by a particular warmth of tone, a strategic deployment of courtesy markers, and a calibrated softness that simultaneously communicates respect for the social conventions of the interaction and maintains the speaker's dignity within them. This register is a survival mechanism. It developed over centuries of interaction between black women and white institutional gatekeepers in the South, and its purpose is to reduce friction, to make the interaction proceed smoothly, to avoid triggering the racial threat responses that can sabotage outcomes, to get what is needed from the encounter without paying an unnecessary social tax. Mariah, having grown up in a Georgia county where the northern half is predominantly white, and the institutions of daily life, the DMFI, the grocery store, the doctor's office, are staffed by people from diverse racial backgrounds, would have absorbed this register through 1,000 daily interactions. The fourth register is the performance register, the vocal and behavioral mode she inhabits when she is on stage, in a studio, or in a public-facing media context as Mariah the scientist, rather than Mariah Buckles. This register synthesizes elements of all three preceding registers, but adds a layer of artistic persona, a tonal quality, a rhythm of speech, a mode of self-presentation that is calibrated to communicate vulnerability, emotional depth, and creative seriousness simultaneously. It is the register that makes her legible to her audience as an artist rather than a person, and it is the register through which her musical output, the albums, the performances, the music videos, is mediated. Now here is what makes this register architecture structurally significant rather than merely interesting. Each register maps onto a specific social marketplace. The institutional register maps onto the business side of the entertainment industry and the broader world of professional services. The Black Atlanta feminine vernacular maps onto the social spaces where hip-hop and R&B artists actually live. The studios, the parties, the informal gatherings where relationships are formed and maintained. The Southern Feminine Register maps onto the cross-racial interactions that are unavoidable in a diverse metropolitan area. And the Performance Register maps onto the public-facing marketplace of audience engagement and media interaction. An individual who can only operate in one register is confined to one marketplace. An individual who can operate in two is more versatile but still limited. An individual who can move fluidly across all four, switching not just the words but the intonation, the body language, the behavioral norms, the entire semiotic package, has access to all four marketplaces simultaneously. And not just access, optimization. Because in each marketplace, the individual can deploy the register that maximizes their capital return, seamlessly adjusting their presentation to match the expectations and norms of the specific social environment they are navigating. This is not something that can be taught in a course. It is not something that can be acquired through deliberate practice in the way that a musical instrument can be learned. It is an emergent capability that develops only under very specific structural conditions. Conditions where an individual is regularly exposed to multiple social environments with different norms, where the stakes of miscalibration are high enough to incentivize precision, and where the exposure begins early enough that the registers are absorbed at a near native level rather than learned as foreign modes. South DeKalb, with its middle-class families and working-class environments, its proximity to both black cultural spaces and white institutional spaces, its school system that demanded institutional performance within a culturally black context, was precisely such an environment. The conditions that produced Mariah Buckles' code-switching fluency are the same conditions: the white flight, the demographic inversion, the institutional lag, that I described as the fourth dimension of DeKalb County. The code switching did not develop despite the structural conditions. It developed because of them. And I want to illustrate how this plays out in Mariah's actual career, because the abstraction means nothing if it cannot be grounded in observable reality. Consider the trajectory of her record label relationships. She began with Tory Lanez and One Umbrella Records, a small independent label affiliated with RCA, a major label. In this environment, the relevant register was a hybrid, the street-coded cultural register that made her legible to Lanez and his ecosystem, combined with enough institutional register to navigate the formal aspects of signing a recording contract. She was functional in this environment, but the power dynamic was asymmetric. Lanez held the production resources, the distribution access, and the industry connections, while she held primarily her talent and her potential commercial value. When she left One Umbrella and RCA, she entered a negotiation phase that required a different register configuration entirely. Negotiating a new label deal as an independent artist who has already released one album requires the full institutional register, the ability to evaluate contract terms, to articulate specific needs, to communicate as an equal rather than a supplicant. Her quote from the Billboard interview about being reluctant to sign a new deal but finding a partner with the right infrastructure reveals a speaker operating in the institutional register at a sophisticated level. The language is precise. The framing positions her as a strategic decision-maker rather than a grateful recipient. This is not how an artist from a purely counter-institutional background would engage with a media outlet. This is someone who has internalized the institutional register deeply enough to deploy it in a high-stakes public communication. When she signed with Epic Records, the register shifted again. A joint venture deal, which is what she reportedly secured, is a structurally different arrangement from a standard recording contract. In a joint venture, the artist retains more creative control and a larger share of revenue, but also assumes more financial risk. Securing such a deal requires demonstrating not just artistic viability, but business acumen, the ability to manage an operation, to make strategic decisions about releases and touring, to function as a partner rather than an employee. The institutional register is necessary here, but so is the ability to code switch into the cultural register when the context demands it. When she's in a studio with a producer, when she is engaging with other artists, when she is performing. The joint venture framework rewards precisely the kind of register versatility that Mariah possesses. And when she entered Young Thug's social orbit, a different register configuration was activated. In his world, the world of Atlanta's most visible and most legally exposed rapper, the cultural register was primary. To be accepted, to be trusted, to be brought inside the social circle of a man who was under constant legal surveillance and who operated in an environment where the wrong word to the wrong person could have catastrophic consequences, Mariah needed to be perceived as fully authentic. The institutional register, in this context, would have been a liability. It would have signaled outsider status, institutional allegiance, potential untrustworthiness. She needed the Black Atlanta feminine vernacular, the warmth, the directness, the phonological markers that communicate belonging. And she needed the ability to shift, invisibly and instantly, into the institutional register when the context required it, when speaking to his attorneys, when interfacing with media, when navigating the courtroom environment during his trial. This is why I call code switching capital infrastructure rather than a communication skill. A skill is something you use occasionally when the situation demands it. Infrastructure is something that everything else is built on. Without the code-switching architecture, Mariah's vocal talent could not have been deployed in the market where it generated the highest returns. Without the code-switching architecture, her institutional literacy could not have been translated into the ambient fluency that made her valuable in elite black male spaces. Without the code-switching architecture, her aesthetic legibility would have been a static attribute rather than an active tool. She would have been seen, but she could not have been heard across registers, and being heard is what converts presence into influence. Let me push this further, because there is a dimension of the code-switching architecture that connects back to the ATL blueprint in a way that reveals something genuinely new. In the film, Lauren London's character Nunu is discovered, her affluent background is revealed, and the revelation creates a crisis. The mimicry fails because the underlying identity is exposed. But in Mariah Buckles' case, there is no equivalent discovery event because there is nothing to discover. She is not mimicking a class she does not belong to. She is genuinely a product of the structural conditions that shaped her, both the middle-class family and the working-class environment. Her code switching is not deception. It is authentic multilingualism. She is native to all four registers in the way that a child raised in a bilingual household is native to both languages. There is no original language beneath the switching. The switching is the original. This distinction matters enormously because it means that the capital arbitrage Mariah performs is sustainable in a way that Nunu's was not. Nunu's arbitrage was fragile. It depended on concealment, and concealment can always be broken. Mariah's arbitrage is structural. It depends on genuine fluency, and genuine fluency does not break. She can be known completely. Her Southwest DeKalb background, her middle-class family, her university experience, her entire biography, and the arbitrage still functions because the arbitrage does not depend on hiding any element of who she is. It depends on the fact that who she is, the full, unedited, structurally produced configuration of all her attributes, happens to be precisely optimized for the marketplace she occupies. The arbitrage is not in the concealment, it is in the rarity. The marketplace does not pay a premium because it does not know what she is. It pays a premium because what she is almost never exists. And this is where I want to introduce the concept that ties the entire analysis together. I have been describing individual frameworks: positional liquidity conversion, structural liminality advantage, ambient institutional fluency, as if they are separate mechanisms. They are not. They are facets of a single underlying structure. And that structure is what I'm going to call the liminal capital engine. It is the mechanism by which an individual who exists between systems, who is produced by the friction between systems, whose capital portfolio does not fit any single system's pipeline, converts that very unfitness into outsized returns by locating the marketplace where the specific configuration of their unfitness is precisely what the marketplace needs. The liminal capital engine has three components. The first is a structurally produced capital portfolio that is mismatched to all available institutional pipelines. The second is a code-switching architecture that allows the individual to translate that portfolio across multiple social environments. The third is a marketplace, typically informal, typically outside institutional surveillance, typically operating in the gaps between formal systems, where the specific combination of attributes in the portfolio commands a scarcity premium. When all three components are present, the engine runs. The individual generates value that no formal system predicted, that no credential certifies, and that no institutional pipeline was designed to produce. They appear, from the outside, to have gotten lucky. They appear to have been in the right place at the right time. They appear to have been blessed with some ineffable quality, charisma, star power, it factor, that explains their success. But there is no luck involved. There is no ineffable quality. There is a structural engine running on the fuel of systemic mismatch, and the engine is as predictable and as mechanical as any other engine. You just have to know what to look for. Mariah Buckles did not get lucky. She is a liminal capital engine operating at full capacity, and the system that built her, DeKalb County, its schools, its demographics, its fourth dimensional infrastructure, is building more of them. They are emerging from every environment in America where the structural conditions produce individuals whose capital portfolios are too complex for any single pipeline to hold. They are the excess production of a stratified system that has no category for what they are. And they are increasingly finding their way to the marketplaces, entertainment, social media, the attention economy, the influencer ecosystem, where the liminal capital engine runs most efficiently. The question is not whether they will continue to emerge. They will. The question is whether the system will ever develop the capacity to see them for what they are. Everything I have described so far has been specific to one woman, one trajectory, one set of structural conditions producing one capital portfolio deployed in one marketplace. And if that were all this analysis contained, a detailed structural biography of Mariah Buckles, it would be interesting but limited, a case study, an anecdote dressed up in analytical language. The reason this analysis matters beyond Mariah Buckles is that the structural engine I have identified, the liminal capital engine, is not specific to her. It is a general mechanism. It operates wherever stratified social systems exist in geographic proximity. It produces individuals with mismatched capital portfolios wherever the conditions for its operation are present. And it is accelerating. Let me show you why by extending the frameworks beyond the specific evidence and testing them against other domains. Because if the liminal capital engine is real, if it is a genuine structural mechanism, rather than an artifact of how I have chosen to describe one woman's career, it should be portable. It should explain phenomena in domains beyond the one where I discovered it. And it does. Consider the technology industry. Silicon Valley's founding mythology says that the greatest technology companies were built by visionary individuals, dropouts, misfits, people who did not fit the institutional mold, who saw opportunities that the establishment could not see. Steve Jobs dropped out of Reed College. Mark Zuckerberg left Harvard. Bill Gates did not finish his degree. The narrative frames these departures as acts of individual genius. The visionary was too brilliant, too restless, too forward-thinking to be contained by the institutional pipeline. But look at what actually happened through the lens of the liminal capital engine. Steve Jobs was adopted into a middle-class family in Mountain View, California, a community that was, in the 1960s and 70s, situated at the contact point between Stanford University's academic ecosystem and the emerging electronics industry. He absorbed enough institutional culture to understand how technology companies operated and enough countercultural sensibility from the 1970s Bay Area to reject the institutional norms that constrained corporate innovation. His capital portfolio, technical intuition, design sensibility, institutional awareness, countercultural aesthetic, was mismatched to every existing pipeline, too unconventional for IBM, too commercially minded for the academic world, too aesthetically driven for the engineering culture of early Silicon Valley. He did not fit. And the marketplace that rewarded his specific configuration of unfitness was one that did not yet exist. The personal computer market, which required someone who could translate between the technical world and the consumer world, between the engineering register and the design register, between the institutional and the countercultural. The liminal capital engine running on a different fuel in a different geography, but operating by the same mechanism. Or consider the fashion industry. Virgil Abloh, the late designer who became the artistic director of Louis Vuitton's menswear division, grew up in Rockford, Illinois, The son of Ghanaian immigrants, he studied civil engineering at the University of Wisconsin and architecture at the Illinois Institute of Technology. His institutional preparation was in engineering and architecture, disciplines with formal credentialing mechanisms, professional pipelines, and well-defined career trajectories. But his cultural preparation, his immersion in hip-hop culture, his apprenticeship with Kanye West, his fluency in the visual language of streetwear, was entirely outside those pipelines. His capital portfolio was mismatched to every available institutional pathway. Too street for the architecture firms, too academic for the streetwear brands, too hip-hop for the fashion establishment. He was a liminal capital engine whose code-switching architecture allowed him to translate between the world of high fashion and the world of street culture, between the institutional register of design criticism and the cultural register of hip-hop aesthetics. And the marketplace that rewarded his specific configuration, the luxury fashion industry's desperate need for cultural relevance with a younger, more diverse consumer base, paid an enormous premium for exactly the kind of translation he could perform. Or consider politics. Barack Obama, and I am aware that invoking this name opens an analytical territory that has been heavily traversed, but I am going to traverse it differently. Obama grew up in Hawaii, the biracial son of a Kenyan father and a Kansas-born mother, raised by white grandparents in a racially ambiguous environment. He attended Occidental College in Los Angeles before transferring to Columbia University in New York, then went to Harvard Law School. His institutional credentials were impeccable, but his cultural portfolio was irreducible to any single category. He was not fully of the Black American experience, having been raised outside the continental Black community. He was not fully of the white American experience, being visibly Black and carrying a name that was phonologically foreign to white American ears. He was not fully of any immigrant experience, having been raised by a white American family rather than within a Kenyan immigrant community. His capital portfolio was mismatched to every existing political pipeline. Too Black for the white political establishment, too white adjacent for the traditional Black political establishment, too cosmopolitan for the heartland, too young for the Senate old guard. And yet, the marketplace that rewarded his specific configuration, a Democratic electorate in 2008 that was desperate for a candidate who could unite a fragile coalition of Black voters, white liberals, young people, and educated professionals, paid the highest possible premium for the exact translation he could perform. He could speak in the institutional register of constitutional law and policy analysis, and he could speak in the register of Black Baptist preaching tradition. He could navigate a conversation with a factory worker in Ohio and a conversation with a room full of Wall Street donors. His code-switching architecture was the operating system on which his entire political career ran, and the liminal capital engine that produced him was driven by the same mechanism I have described for Mariah Buckles, a specific structural condition of geographic and cultural liminality that produced a capital portfolio mismatched to every existing pipeline, deployed through code switching into a marketplace where the scarcity of that specific combination commanded an unprecedented premium. The pattern is general. It is not limited to entertainment or politics or technology or fashion. It operates wherever the following conditions are present. First, a stratified social landscape where different environments with different capital profiles exist in geographic proximity. Second, an individual whose formative conditions span the contact zone between two or more of these environments, producing a capital portfolio that is natively fluent in multiple registers, but fully optimized for none of the existing pipelines. Third, a marketplace, typically one that is expanding, undergoing structural change, or experiencing a mismatch between its needs and the available talent supply, where the specific combination of cross-register fluency commands a scarcity premium. When all three conditions are met, the liminal capital engine activates, and the individual it produces appears to the outside world to be a prodigy, a natural, a once-in-a-generation talent. They are none of these things. They are a structural output, a predictable product of quantifiable conditions. The only reason they appear extraordinary is that the system has no framework for seeing what produced them. And here is where I want to push the analysis into territory that I believe is genuinely new, territory that no existing academic literature occupies, because it requires synthesizing insights from sociology, economics, urban geography, network theory, and cultural studies simultaneously. The territory is this. The liminal capital engine is not just producing individual outliers, it is producing a new structural class. In the 20th century, the American class system was organized around a clear pipeline hierarchy: working class into service and manufacturing jobs, middle class into professional and white-collar jobs, upper class into ownership and management positions. Each class had its own educational pipeline, its own cultural norms, its own behavioral registers. And the pipelines were, for the most part, separate. A working class individual could, with exceptional effort and some structural support, move into the middle class pipeline. A middle class individual could, with the right credentials and connections, move into the upper class pipeline. But the movement was vertical, up or down a single hierarchy, and the pipelines were designed to receive individuals who fit their specifications. What the liminal capital engine produces are individuals who do not fit any pipeline's specifications. They are too culturally fluent for the institutional pipeline. They are too institutionally literate for the cultural pipeline. They are too complex, too multidimensional, too register versatile to be absorbed by any single system. In the 20th century, these individuals were anomalies, statistically rare, socially invisible, lacking any collective identity or shared institutional infrastructure. They were exceptions that the system could ignore, but the structural conditions that produce them are intensifying. Urbanization is increasing geographic proximity between stratified environments. Immigration is multiplying the number of cultural registers available in any given metropolitan area. The decline of manufacturing and the rise of the service and knowledge economies are eroding the clean pipeline hierarchies that once sorted individuals into predictable trajectories. The expansion of the entertainment industry, social media, the attention economy, and the influencer ecosystem is creating new marketplaces that reward precisely the kind of cross-register fluency that the liminal capital engine produces. And the educational system, particularly in environments like South DeKalb, where the institutional infrastructure is simultaneously prestigious and structurally inadequate, is producing more individuals with mismatched capital portfolios than ever before. The result is a growing population of individuals who are structurally uncategorizable by the existing system. They do not show up in labor statistics as a distinct category. They do not have a professional association or a shared credential. They do not have a name, but they are there, and they are increasingly visible in the spaces where the existing categories break down, in entertainment, in entrepreneurship, in the influencer economy, in the margins between formal systems where translation between worlds is the most valuable service anyone can perform. I want to be careful here, because I am moving into speculative territory, and the protocol I have set for myself demands that I identify speculation as such. What I'm about to say is a hypothesis, not a finding. The hypothesis is this: the liminal capital engine is not just a mechanism that explains individual trajectories. It is a mechanism that is producing, at scale, the workforce that the 21st century economy most urgently needs. The economy is increasingly organized around platforms, networks, and attention markets that reward the ability to translate, to move information, cultural products, and social capital across boundaries between communities that do not share common norms. The individuals who can perform this translation, the individuals produced by the liminal capital engine, are not marginal. They are the emerging center. The system just does not have a framework for seeing them yet, because the framework was built for a different economy, one organized around pipelines rather than networks, around specialization rather than fluency, around depth within a single domain rather than breadth across multiple domains. If this hypothesis is correct, then Mariah Buckles is not an outlier. She is an early indicator. She is what the system looks like when it begins to produce individuals for an economy that has not yet developed the institutional infrastructure to recognize, credential, or value what they are. Her career, the trajectory from Southwest DeKalb to St. John's to SoundCloud to Tory Lanez to Epic Records to a Young Thug's courtroom, is not a story of choices and chances. It is a story of a system struggling to process an output it did not intend to create. And the entertainment industry, which absorbed her not because it understood what she was, but because it happened to be the marketplace where her specific capital configuration was most liquid, the entertainment industry is the early stage absorption market for a structural class that does not yet have a name. The question of what happens when that class reaches critical mass, when the number of liminal capital engine outputs exceeds the entertainment industry's absorptive capacity and begins to flow into other sectors, is a question I cannot answer with the evidence available. But I can say this: the structural conditions that produce them are not going to reverse. DeKalb County is not going to resegregate. The demographic inversions that create the contact zones where mismatched capital portfolios are forged are not going to undo themselves. The educational systems that produce individuals who are simultaneously overprepared and underprepared, too much for where they are, not enough for where they are aimed, are not going to resolve the contradiction. The liminal capital engine is going to keep running, and the system is going to keep being surprised by what it produces, but it should not be surprised. Because the engine is not malfunctioning. The engine is working precisely as the structural conditions dictate. The system simply has not built the diagnostics to see it. I have spent the preceding sections analyzing the system that produced Mariah Buckles and the mechanisms through which her capital portfolio was deployed. But I have said almost nothing about the music itself. And this is not an accident, it is a methodological choice. Because the way music is typically discussed, in terms of artistic quality, emotional resonance, vocal ability, production choices, genre positioning, obscures the structural function that the music performs. To understand what Mariah the scientist's music is actually doing, you have to stop listening to it as art and start reading it as data. The music is a structural document. It is the audible residue of the liminal capital engine operating in real time, and every element of it, The vocal register, the lyrical content, the production aesthetic, the genre positioning, the way it sits in the marketplace relative to other R&B artists, encodes information about the structural conditions that produced it. Start with the vocal register. Mariah's singing voice occupies a very specific position in the landscape of contemporary R&B. It is not the powerhouse melismatic style of a Beyoncé or a Whitney Houston, voices that announce themselves, that dominate a room, that communicate mastery through sheer technical force. It is not the breathy, whisper-soft aesthetic of artists like Jhené Aiko or SZA, voices that communicate intimacy through restraint and vulnerability through volume reduction. Mariah's voice sits between these poles. It is technically competent. She can hold a note. She can navigate melodic intervals. She can modulate her dynamics. But it is not technically dominant. Its primary characteristic is a quality I would describe as confessional precision. She sounds like someone telling you something specific and true in a tone that is calibrated to be heard by one person even when thousands are listening. The voice communicates a paradox, public intimacy. The listener feels addressed individually, even in a mass medium. This vocal positioning is not arbitrary. It is a direct expression of the structural liminality I have been describing. A voice that dominates communicates power, certainty, institutional authority. It is the vocal equivalent of the institutional register. A voice that whispers communicates vulnerability, fragility, emotional surrender. It is the vocal equivalent of retreat from institutional norms into pure effect. Mariah's voice does neither. It communicates the experience of someone who is navigating between worlds, who is simultaneously competent and exposed, who is telling you the truth about a situation that is more complex than any single emotional register can capture. The voice is the sound of the liminal capital engine. It is what structural liminality sounds like when it becomes music. Now, consider the lyrical content. Mariah's songwriting is overwhelmingly concerned with romantic relationships, their intensity, their instability, their capacity to generate both euphoria and devastation. This is not unusual for R&B. The genre has always been organized around romantic and sexual themes, but the way Mariah engages these themes reveals something structurally specific. Her lyrics do not narrate romance from a position of innocence or discovery. They narrate it from a position of analytical awareness. She is not wondering what is happening in the relationship. She knows what is happening. She can see the dynamics clearly. And the pain in the music comes not from confusion, but from clarity, from the experience of understanding a system while being unable to change it. This is the emotional signature of institutional literacy applied to intimate life. It is the feeling of a person who can read the contract but cannot alter the terms. Consider the song Always and Forever from her second album, Rye Rye World. The song is a meditation on the desire for permanence in a relationship that the singer knows, on some level, cannot provide it. The emotional architecture is not naive hope. It is informed longing, the kind of longing that comes from understanding the structural conditions that make the desired outcome unlikely while still wanting it anyway. This is not a generic love song. It is a song about wanting something that your own analytical capacity tells you is improbable, and the tension between the emotional desire and the structural knowledge is what gives the song its power. This tension is, structurally, the same tension that defines Mariah's entire trajectory, the tension between aspiration and structural constraint, between what the individual wants and what the system allows. Or consider the album To Be Eaten Alive, released in 2023 on Epic Records, with Young Thug already incarcerated. The title itself is a structural statement. To be eaten alive is a description of consumption, of being absorbed, devoured, processed by a system that takes everything and returns only what serves its own interests. Read as a biographical document, the album is a meditation on the experience of being in a relationship with a man who is being consumed by the carceral state, eaten alive by a legal system that has the power to take years of his life. But read as a structural document, the album is about something larger. It is about the experience of existing within systems that consume the individuals they are supposed to serve, the school system that consumed her preparation, the medical pipeline that consumed her aspiration, the music industry that consumed her autonomy during the Tory Lanez era, the legal system that consumed her partner. The album title is not a metaphor. It is a structural description, and the music on the album, intimate, precisely crafted, emotionally acute, is the sound of someone who has been inside multiple consuming systems and has emerged with the analytical clarity to describe the experience without being destroyed by it. The production aesthetic reinforces this reading. Mariah's music is typically built on relatively sparse production beds, atmospheric synth pads, minimalist drum patterns, occasional guitar textures that create space for the voice rather than competing with it. This is a deliberate aesthetic choice, but it also maps onto the structural analysis. Maximalist production, dense layers of sound, aggressive bass, complex rhythmic patterns, communicates abundance, surplus, overwhelming force. It is the sonic equivalent of institutional power. Minimalist production communicates something different, precision within constraint. The ability to do a lot with a little, the capacity to generate emotional impact, not through the accumulation of resources, but through the strategic deployment of limited ones. This is again the sound of the liminal capital engine, an engine that generates outsized returns not from overwhelming capital, but from the strategic deployment of mismatched capital in the right marketplace. The genre positioning is equally revealing. Mariah is categorized as R&B, but her music does not sit comfortably within the genre's mainstream. It is too introspective for the club-oriented wing of R&B. It is too melodically conventional for the experimental wing. It is too emotionally specific for the generalized love song tradition. It occupies a niche that has been described by critics as alternative R&B or indie R&B, a designation that signals commercial viability within a specific audience segment rather than mass crossover appeal. This positioning is significant because it mirrors her structural position in every other dimension. She is not fully of any single genre in the same way that she is not fully of any single social world. She exists between categories. And the audience that responds most strongly to her music, the audience that fills her tours, that streams her albums, that follows her social media, is disproportionately composed of people who recognize that betweenness, who themselves exist between categories, who find in her music a reflection of their own structural liminality. This is why Mariah the Scientist's audience is loyal in a way that exceeds what her commercial metrics would predict. Her streaming numbers, while growing, her feature on T. Grizzly and Chris Brown's IDGAF debuted on the Billboard Hot 100 in January 2024, and her 21 Savage collaboration Dark Days reached number 70 on the same chart, are not at the level of mainstream R&B superstars. Her album sales are solid, but not blockbuster. Her touring is successful, but not arena level. By the metrics the industry uses to evaluate commercial dominance, she is a mid-tier artist, but the intensity of her audience's engagement, the emotional investment, the community identification, the sense of personal connection that fans describe in their online discourse exceeds what mid-tier commercial metrics would suggest. This discrepancy is the audience-level manifestation of the liminal capital engine. The audience is not responding to commercial positioning or marketing strategy. They are responding to the structural resonance, the recognition that this artist is articulating, through music, an experience of betweenness that they themselves live but have never heard named. Her most recent album, Hearts Sold Separately, released in 2025, and the singles Burning Blue and the number 30 debut on the Hot 100 that preceded it, suggest that the commercial metrics are beginning to catch up with the structural resonance. The audience is growing, the industry infrastructure around her, the Epic Records joint venture, the touring apparatus, the brand partnerships with Adidas Originals and Smirnoff is expanding. But the growth is not the story. The story is the mechanism that produced both the artist and the audience, the same structural conditions operating at scale, creating supply and demand simultaneously. The liminal capital engine does not just produce the individual, it produces the market for the individual. The same demographic shifts, educational contradictions, and class compressions that created Mariah Buckles are creating, in every metropolitan area in America, the audience that recognizes what she is. The music, then, is not separate from the structural analysis. It is the structural analysis, expressed in a medium that the system cannot censor, because the system does not recognize what it contains. The record label hears R&B. The streaming platform categorizes it as a genre. The critic evaluates it as art. None of them hear what it actually is, a structural document encoded in melody, produced by a liminal capital engine consumed by an audience that is itself a product of the same engine. The music is the engine's output in its most compressed form. It is the sound of a system that cannot see itself, heard by the people the system cannot categorize. I have built an elaborate analytical structure. I have named novel frameworks. I have drawn connections across disciplines and across domains. And now I have to do the thing that separates genuine analysis from persuasion. I have to try to tear it down. I have to present the strongest possible arguments against the frameworks I have constructed, address them honestly, and show you where the analysis holds and where it bends. Because an argument that cannot survive adversarial scrutiny is not an argument, it is a narrative. And narratives, however compelling, are not knowledge. The strongest counterargument to the entire analysis is the agency objection. It goes like this. You have constructed a deterministic account of Mariah Buckles' career that treats her as a product of structural forces, rather than as an autonomous individual making choices. You have reduced a human being to an output of a system. You have erased her agency, her creativity, her willpower, her talent, and replaced them with demographic data and capital theory. This is dehumanizing. It denies the reality of individual choice and the possibility that Mariah succeeded because she is exceptionally talented, exceptionally driven, and made good decisions at critical junctures, not because some invisible engine was pushing her along a predetermined track. This is a serious objection, and I want to address it directly. The objection is partially correct. I have emphasized structural forces. I have described her trajectory as an inevitability. And I've used language, engine, mechanism, output, that is borrowed from systems theory rather than from humanistic traditions that center individual experience. This was a deliberate analytical choice, not a philosophical claim. I'm not arguing that Mariah Buckles lacks agency. I am arguing that her agency operates within structural constraints that are so powerful, so precisely configured, and so invisible to the individuals they shape that understanding. The constraints is a prerequisite for understanding the agency. She chose to drop out of St. John's. She chose to release music on SoundCloud. She chose to sign with Tory Lanez. She chose to sign with Epic Records. She chose to be in a relationship with Young Thug. Every one of these was a genuine choice made by an autonomous individual. But the choice set, the options available to her at each decision point, was determined by structural conditions she did not create, could not fully perceive, and could not have changed through individual action. The agency is real. The constraints on the agency are also real, and the constraints explain the pattern of choices in a way that the choices alone cannot. Here is an analogy. A river chooses its path. At every point where the terrain presents a fork, the water goes one way and not the other. The choice is real. The water moves based on the specific conditions it encounters at that specific point. But the terrain was not created by the water. The terrain was created by geological forces operating over millions of years. And if you want to understand why the river ended up where it did, describing the choices at each fork is insufficient. You have to describe the terrain. The terrain is the structural analysis. The choices are the individual narrative. Both are true. But the terrain explains the pattern in a way that the choices cannot. The second counterargument is the uniqueness objection. It says, you claim that the liminal capital engine is a general mechanism, but you have only demonstrated it in detail for one case. The other examples you offered, Jobs, Abloh, Obama, were sketches, not full analyses. How do you know that the pattern you identified in Mariah Buckles is not an artifact of your analytical framework rather than a genuine feature of reality? Maybe you found the pattern because you were looking for it, and any sufficiently detailed analysis of any individual would yield a similarly compelling structural account. This objection has real force. The phenomenon of pattern imposition, seeing structure where there is only noise, is one of the most common analytical errors, and it is particularly dangerous in cross-disciplinary synthesis, where the analyst has the freedom to draw connections from a wide range of fields. The risk of confirmation bias is real. I may have unconsciously selected the evidence that supports the framework and ignored the evidence that contradicts it. However, the liminal capital engine framework meets the falsifiability standard I set for it. Here is what would prove it wrong. If an analysis of other individuals from South DeKalb with comparable capital portfolios, similar family backgrounds, similar academic profiles, similar aesthetic configurations, similar cultural exposures, showed that those individuals did not converge on entertainment or other translation-intensive marketplaces, the framework would be weakened. If the structural conditions I described, the white flight, the educational decline, the fourth-dimensional data infrastructure, did not reliably produce individuals with mismatched capital portfolios, the framework would be weakened. If the entertainment industry did not, in fact, disproportionately absorb individuals from liminal structural positions, the framework would be weakened. These are empirical claims that could, in principle, be tested. I have not tested them with statistical rigor because I do not have access to the data sets that would be required. But the claims are specific enough to be tested, which means the framework is scientific rather than unfalsifiable. The third counterargument is the colorism objection, and it is the one I expect to generate the most emotional resistance. Throughout this analysis, I have described Mariah Buckles' physical appearance as a structural variable, dual-register aesthetic legibility, and I have argued that this variable is a component of her capital portfolio that generates measurable returns in specific marketplaces. The objection says, by treating appearance as a capital variable, you are reproducing the same colorist logic that privileges lighter-skinned and more phenotypically ambiguous black women over darker-skinned black women with more stereotypically African features. You are laundering colorism in analytical language. You are saying in polished academic prose what the system already says in brutal practice, that lighter is more valuable. This objection requires a careful response because the distinction between describing a system and endorsing it is essential and easily collapsed. I am describing a system that assigns differential value to different phenotypic presentations. I am not endorsing that system. The system is real. The differential valuation is real. It has measurable effects on outcomes, in employment, in romantic partnerships, in media representation, in social access. Ignoring it in order to avoid discomfort would make the analysis dishonest. But describing it without naming it as what it is, a product of white supremacist aesthetic hierarchies that have been internalized across racial communities, would also be dishonest, so let me name it. The premium that Mariah Buckles' appearance commands in certain marketplaces is a product of colorism. Colorism is a product of white supremacy. The capital that her appearance generates is real capital in the same way that inherited wealth is real wealth, It exists, it can be deployed, it generates returns, but its existence is a consequence of an unjust system, and its deployment reproduces that injustice even when the individual deploying it has no conscious intention to do so. The framework I have built does not celebrate this. It documents it. And documenting it is necessary because the alternative, pretending that appearance plays no role in the structural dynamics I am analyzing, would produce a false account in which Mariah Buckles' trajectory appears even more mysterious than it actually is. The discomfort that this dimension of the analysis provokes is appropriate. The discomfort should be directed at the system, not at the analysis. The fourth counterargument is the exploitation objection. It says, your analysis of Mariah's role in elite black male spaces, particularly the concept of ambient institutional fluency, comes dangerously close to describing a woman whose primary value is her utility to men. You have framed her as an insurance policy, a translation node, a structural bridge, all functions defined in relation to male needs. This reproduces a patriarchal framework in which women's value is measured by their service to men rather than by their autonomous achievements. This is a legitimate concern, and I want to acknowledge that the language I used, insurance policy, structural function, was drawn from the raw transcript and developed into analytical terms that do center the male perspective more than they should. The correction is this. Mariah Buckles' value in elite black male spaces is real, but it is a derivative of a more fundamental value, her capacity for cross-register translation that is not defined in relation to men. The same capability that makes her valuable to Young Thug also makes her valuable to her label, to her audience, to her own creative practice, and to any context where translation between institutional and counter-institutional registers is needed. The analysis I have conducted focused heavily on the romantic relationship because the raw transcript emphasized it, and because the Young Thug case study provided the most dramatic illustration of how ambient institutional fluency operates. But the framework itself is not gender-dependent. The liminal capital engine produces its outputs regardless of gender. The marketplaces where those outputs are deployed include, but are not limited to, romantic and social relationships with men. The fifth counterargument is the most challenging because it attacks the methodology rather than the content. It says, you have taken a voice transcript, an unfiltered stream of consciousness from a single individual, and used it as the basis for constructing elaborate, analytical frameworks with named mechanisms and cross-domain applications. This is intellectually reckless. The raw material does not support the weight of the analytical structure you have placed on it. You are building a skyscraper on a foundation of sand. I partially concede this objection. The analytical structure I have built exceeds what the raw transcript alone can support. The transcript provided direction. It identified the pattern, the case study, the parallel to the ATL film, the concept of capital arbitrage, the observation about the carceral state pipeline. But the frameworks, the named mechanisms, the cross-domain applications, the statistical data about Southwest DeKalb, the historical analysis of DeKalb County's demographic transformation, all of this was constructed through research and synthesis that went far beyond what the transcript contained. The transcript was a compass. The analysis is a map drawn by following that compass into territory the compass holder had not fully explored. Whether the map is accurate depends not on the compass, but on the quality of the cartography. And cartography can always be improved with more data, more rigorous testing, and more adversarial scrutiny than a single analytical pass can provide. What I can say with confidence is this. The structural conditions I described are real and documented. DeKalb County's demographic transformation is historical fact. The Crawford-Lewis scandal is a matter of public record. Southwest DeKalb's academic metrics are published federal data. Mariah Buckles' biography, her school, her university, her scholarship, her career trajectory, her relationships, is documented in multiple public sources. The frameworks I built to connect these facts are interpretive constructions, not empirical proofs. They are hypotheses dressed in analytical language, and like all hypotheses, they should be held with appropriate epistemic humility, taken seriously enough to be tested, not so seriously that they become dogma. The analysis survives the adversarial testing, but it survives with scars. The agency objection reminds us that structural analysis is a complement to, not a replacement for, individual narrative. The uniqueness objection reminds us that a single case study cannot establish a general mechanism. The colorism objection reminds us that describing a system and endorsing it are different acts, but that the description must be explicitly situated in a moral framework to prevent it from being read as endorsement. The exploitation objection reminds us that analytical frameworks carry ideological freight, and that the framing choices we make determine which dimensions of reality become visible and which remain obscured. And the methodological objection reminds us that the distance between a compelling narrative and a proven theory is the distance between suggestion and demonstration, and that suggestion, however elaborate, however internally consistent, is not demonstration. I offer the analysis as a suggestion. A well-researched, cross-disciplinarily informed, structurally grounded suggestion. What it requires to become something more is what all serious analytical work requires: engagement from other minds, additional evidence, competing interpretations, and the slow, collaborative process by which hypotheses are refined into knowledge. I have done the first pass. The territory is mapped. The landmarks are named. What remains is for others to walk the territory and report what they find. We began with a woman. We end with a system. Mariah Amani Buckles was born on October 27, 1997, in Atlanta, Georgia. Her father sold real estate. Her mother managed finances. Her sister Morgan would eventually manage her tours. She grew up on the east side of Atlanta in a community that was, at the moment of her birth, in the middle of a demographic transformation that had been building for 30 years. A transformation driven by black suburban migration, white flight, property tax redistribution, and the slow hollowing of institutional infrastructure that occurs when a population changes, but the systems that serve it do not keep pace. She attended Southwest DeKalb High School, where she was one of approximately 1,200 students, 94% of whom were black, and functionally, all of whom qualified for economic assistance. She graduated a year early. She earned a biology scholarship to St. John's University in Queens, New York. She wanted to be a pediatric anesthesiologist. None of that happened. What happened instead was that a structural engine, assembled over decades by forces no individual orchestrated or intended, converted the specific configuration of her attributes into a trajectory that no pipeline was designed to produce. She became a singer. She became an artist whose music sits between genres in the same way her life sits between social worlds. She became a woman whose value in the entertainment ecosystem is not primarily about what she can do, sing, write, perform, but about what she is, a node that connects worlds that have no other connection. She became, without anyone naming it, the embodiment of a structural class that the American system is producing in increasing numbers, and that the American system has no framework for recognizing. I've called this the liminal capital engine. I have described its components: the structurally produced capital mismatch, the code-switching architecture, the scarcity premium marketplace. I have tested it against other domains and found it portable. I have subjected it to adversarial scrutiny and found it survivable. And now I want to look at what it means. Not for Mariah Buckles specifically, but for the system that is producing people like her. The first thing it means is that the conversation about inequality needs a new dimension. The existing conversation is organized around two poles: access and outcomes. The access conversation asks, do people from disadvantaged backgrounds have access to education, to employment, to healthcare, to capital? The outcomes conversation asks, given that access, what do people from disadvantaged backgrounds achieve? The liminal capital engine reveals a third dimension that neither conversation captures: misalignment. It is possible, and, as I have shown, increasingly common, for an individual to have access to institutional resources and to achieve measurable outcomes through those resources, and yet for the institutional pipeline to be fundamentally misaligned with the individual's actual capital portfolio. Mariah Buckles had access. She had outcomes: a high school diploma, a college scholarship, a biology enrollment. The system could point to her and say, the pipeline is working. But the pipeline was not working. It was channeling her toward a destination her preparation could not support while ignoring the destination her preparation was actually optimized for. The mismatch was invisible to the system's metrics. The system measures access and outcomes. It does not measure fit. This has enormous implications for how we think about educational policy, career guidance, and the institutional infrastructure that sorts individuals into professional pipelines. The current system operates on the assumption that talent, properly credentialed through the educational system, will find its appropriate market. The reality that the liminal capital engine reveals is that a significant and growing proportion of talented individuals are being credentialed for markets that cannot use them while remaining uncredentialed for markets that desperately need them. The woman who could be the most effective translator between the institutional world and the counter-institutional world, the woman who could bridge the gap between a record label's legal department and a rapper facing a RICO charge, between a hospital administrator and a community health worker, between a venture capital firm and a first-generation entrepreneur, is being trained for pediatric anesthesiology. Not because anesthesiology is wrong for her, but because the system has no mechanism for identifying what is right for her. It has no pipeline for translators. It has no credential for cross-register fluency. It has no GPA for code switching, and so it defaults to the nearest available institutional category and hopes for the best. The second thing the liminal capital engine means is that the entertainment industry's role in the American economy is far more structurally significant than it appears. The standard account of the entertainment industry positions it as a cultural sector, important for its aesthetic and social contributions, but economically peripheral relative to manufacturing, technology, finance, and healthcare. But through the lens of the liminal capital engine, the entertainment industry is something else entirely. It is the primary absorption market for the system's excess production, the place where individuals whose capital portfolios do not fit any institutional pipeline go to convert their mismatched attributes into economic value. It is not peripheral. It is the overflow valve. It is where the system sends the people it cannot process. This reframes every conversation about why so many talented young people from disadvantaged backgrounds aspire to careers in entertainment, in music, in sports, in social media, in content creation. The standard explanation is cultural. They see celebrities who look like them and want to be like those celebrities. The structural explanation is different and more uncomfortable. They aspire to entertainment because their structural conditions have produced capital portfolios that are misaligned with every institutional pipeline and optimally aligned with the translation-intensive, register-fluid, informally structured marketplace of entertainment. They are not choosing entertainment because they lack ambition. They are choosing entertainment because the system has given them no other marketplace where their actual capabilities are valued. The aspiration is not a failure of imagination. It is a rational response to a structural mismatch that the system refuses to acknowledge. The third thing the liminal capital engine means is that Atlanta, specifically, the configuration of communities like South DeKalb that exist at the contact zone between post-white flight institutional infrastructure and a growing black population, is not just producing artists. It is producing the prototype for a new kind of worker, a worker whose primary capability is not specialization within a single domain, but translation across multiple domains, a worker whose value lies not in what they know, but in how many worlds they can navigate, a worker whose capital portfolio is optimized not for a pipeline, but for a network, a decentralized multinodal economy where the ability to move between communities, between registers, between institutional and counter-institutional contexts is the scarcest and most valuable capability available. The 21st century economy is, increasingly, this kind of economy. The platform economy rewards creators who can speak to multiple audiences. The gig economy rewards workers who can adapt to multiple contexts. The knowledge economy rewards thinkers who can synthesize across disciplines. The attention economy rewards personalities who can be legible across demographic boundaries. All of these economies are, in structural terms, marketplaces that pay a premium for cross-register fluency, for the ability to translate, to bridge, to connect nodes that are not otherwise connected. And the individuals who possess this fluency are disproportionately produced by exactly the structural conditions I have described: stratified environments in geographic proximity, educational systems that are simultaneously prestigious and structurally inadequate, family backgrounds that span the middle-class institutional norm and the working-class cultural norm. The liminal capital engine is not producing anomalies. It is producing what the economy needs. The system just has not built the pipeline to deliver them. And this brings me to the final point, which is not a conclusion, but an opening. The liminal capital engine, as I have described it, operates invisibly. The individuals it produces do not know they are its outputs. The marketplaces that absorb them do not know they are its customers. The structural conditions that power it are documented in no single database, analyzed by no single discipline, and visible to no single institutional vantage point. The engine runs in the dark, and it will continue to run in the dark until someone builds the framework to see it. That is what this analysis has attempted to do. Not to explain Mariah Buckles. She does not need explaining. She is living her life, making her music, navigating her world with the tools the system gave her, and the choices she has made with those tools. What needs explaining is the system. What needs explaining is the machine that takes the raw materials of demographic change, educational policy, housing markets, insurance actuarials, cultural ecology, and racial stratification, and assembles them through no one's intention into a human being whose capital portfolio is precisely configured for a marketplace that was never supposed to exist. The system cannot see what it produces, but you can. You have spent the last several hours inside a framework that did not exist before this analysis was conducted. You now possess a vocabulary: positional liquidity conversion, structural liminality advantage, ambient institutional fluency, the liminal capital engine, for describing a set of phenomena that previously had no names. These are not academic terms. They are not jargon for its own sake. They are tools. They are the conceptual equivalent of a diagnostic instrument that, once built, allows you to detect a signal that was always present but previously invisible. The next time you see a young person from a structurally liminal background, from a community like South DeKalb, from a family that straddles the line between institutional access and institutional inadequacy, from an educational system that promises more than it delivers, and you see that person pursuing a career in entertainment or in social media, or in any of the translation-intensive marketplaces that are expanding faster than the institutional system can comprehend, do not see a person who has given up on the system. See a person whose system has given up on them. See the liminal capital engine running. See the structural output that the system produced but cannot name. And know that the engine is accelerating. The conditions that power it, urbanization, immigration, educational stratification, the expansion of the platform economy, are all intensifying. The demographic inversions that create the contact zones where mismatched capital portfolios are forged are spreading to every major metropolitan area in the country. The number of individuals produced by the liminal capital engine is increasing. The number of marketplaces that can absorb them is also increasing. But the institutional system, the educational pipelines, the credentialing mechanisms, the labor market infrastructure is not changing. It is still sorting individuals into categories that were designed for a different economy. It is still measuring access and outcomes while ignoring fit. It is still producing Mariah Buckleses and calling them dropouts. The system built the engine. The engine is running. The only question is whether the system will ever learn to see what it makes. I suspect it will not. But the people the engine produces will see each other. They already do. They just did not have the language for it until now. This is that language.